Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. And I have back with me in part 4 of this epic interview with Jim Bennett, author of A Faithful Response to the CES Letter. Jim, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we've done 3 previous episodes. In part 1, we did sort of like a get to know Jim, and he talked about sort of his motivation for writing his response to the CES letter. He talked about his interactions with Jeremy and his interviews on Mormon Stories and on, it wasn't Mormonism Live. Oh yes, you did go on Mormonism Live and Mormon discussions with Bill Reel. And we talked about the Book of Mormon and a lot of the criticisms with regards to that. I believe in part 2, we talked about the Book of Mormon translation and the Book of Abraham and the First Vision. And then in the last episode, we discussed some of the criticisms made by Jeremy with regards to the priesthood restoration, the witnesses of the gold plates, and temples, and the similarities to Masonry. But I think it's been really fun and good discussion and good interview, and we've had good dialogue. And Jim's been answering the tough questions, which again, I admire his willingness to do that. How do you feel like the previous ones have gone?
I think it's been fun. I think you've asked great questions, had great things to say. I mean, I've answered questions, but I don't know. I don't have the definitive answers.
Yes, of course.
I think that's part of it, is that I think everybody has to confront these questions themselves and do so however they feel is going to be most appropriate to strengthen their own faith. But my goal is to demonstrate that it is possible to confront these questions with intellectual integrity and honesty and still come out with a testimony on the other side.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I agree that I feel where I'm at, that I have to confront these things. I think with the internet and just with more and more people going through a faith crisis or leaving the church, you can't really bury your head in the sand, and you can't necessarily just put these things on the shelf and try to forget about them. And I think a lot of people do have respect for you, Jim. Whenever I've listened to some of the comments in other channels, even if people disagree with your interpretation, your conclusion, I think just the fact that you try to be intellectually honest and you're a good guy. And
well, thank you. Very kind of you.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. So in part 4, this is probably going to be one of the most maybe controversial parts of our interview, because we're going to be talking about polygamy and about prophets. And then hopefully we'll be able to get on to maybe things about Revelation and some criticisms to the modern church that Jeremy brings up. So this will be a fun one.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start with polygamy.
Okay.
So polygamy is probably one of the messiest and most troubling things for most members when it comes to church history. We don't overly enjoy talking about polygamy. I don't know about your upbringing, but I knew the church practiced polygamy in Utah. I don't know if I really knew Joseph Smith was a polygamist or not. If I did know, I knew zero about his marriages to other women. I do remember having an encounter with a woman on my mission who was really hostile towards us. She was this British lady with a really peculiar accent, and she was a neighbor of ours. And we talked to her a lot, and I felt prompted to, share with her the restored gospel in the Book of Mormon. And whenever I brought up Joseph Smith, she just went so hostile, and she was like, that Joe Smith was, just sleeping with loads of women, sexual predator. And she was just saying all those things. And I remember I felt like so offended. And I kind of like rebuked her. And I was like, how dare you, speak evil of the Lord's anointed, so to speak. And I remember it really annoyed me. But then when I came home from a mission, and then whenever I was exposed to Joseph Smith's polygamy, like I remember I read the whole Mormon Think topic on polygamy within a night. I remember it was just like soul like it was really troubling, and it really deeply affected me emotionally. I think this one can be an emotional topic as well. And
no question.
Even if you come from a faithful lens, there's messy things with it. But Joseph Smith's polygamy, so Joseph Smith, he married between 34 to 40 wives. First of all, is there anything you want to say about polygamy before we dive into some of these
Well,
criticisms?
I'm trying to figure out. Polygamy has been very troubling the more I've learned about it, particularly.
Yeah, I agree.
But I don't have the experience of feeling broadsided to discover Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I don't know that I can remember a time when I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't know. It's kind of like, when did I find out there is no Santa Claus? I don't have one of those moments where it was like, oh, wait a minute,
Oh, okay.
that a lot of people describe. I didn't know the extent of it. I didn't know about Fanny Alger until I read Rough Stone Rolling.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that that's why Oliver had left the church. I remember that kind of shook me up. I'm like, wait, his first wife was who now? She was a serving girl in his house, and she was 16 years old. That kind of floored me when I first read that, and that
Yeah.
was what, 15 years ago. I mean, that wasn't all that long ago, relatively speaking. But my grandmother on my father's side was the last surviving daughter of Heber J. Grant, and was the daughter of his youngest wife. Heber J., people forget he was a polygamist because by the time he got to be president of the church, 2 of his 3 wives had died. And so he sort of presented himself as a monogamist. And my grandfather wrote a nasty letter to church magazines because they described his one wife. And they said, you are erasing my wife, his daughter, from a different wife. You are pretending that she doesn't exist.
Right.
And
Because this would have been after the manifesto. So he had multiple
no,
wives. No?
he was very young when he was called into the Quorum of the 12. He was in his early 20s.
Right.
And so he married 3 women fairly quickly, and it was before the manifesto, but not long before the manifesto. And he exchanged letters with all 3 of his wives. And Truman Madsen, who is a descendant of Heber J. Grant, he's my father's first cousin. Do you know who Truman Madsen is?
Mm-hmm.
He read through a lot of these letters, and he said to my grandmother, you need to publish these because these are the best depiction of polygamy. Heber J. managed to make polygamy work in a way that would be very faith promoting for everybody. You ought to publish these. And so my grandmother called Spencer W. Kimball, who was president of the church at the time, and President Kimball actually went to my grandmother's house to sit down and talk to her about this. And he said, you are under no obligation to publish these because there's a lot of polygamy in my family too, and it isn't faith promoting.
Yeah.
It's really messy. And so President Kimball just said, we'd like to keep a lid on this as much as possible. And I think that's been the church's position. I think to some degree, it's still the church's position. We have not, as a church, come anywhere close to confronting the legacy of polygamy and the continuing practice of polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
President Nelson, President Oaks are both sealed to 2 different women, both very open about the fact that they are celestial polygamists.
Yeah.
We have not disavowed that doctrine. That continues. And it's a source of, I think, great pain to a lot of, have you read the Ghost of Eternal Polygamy?
I've not read it, but I think I've listened to her being interviewed on Mormon Stories.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a very compelling, heartbreaking case for the fact that this is not a doctrine that I think many people are comfortable with.
Yeah.
And certainly women are wildly uncomfortable with it because there's really very little, if any, way to reconcile it with an equality between the 2 genders.
Yeah.
Women are subservient in polygamous relationships. Again, maybe Heber J. figured out how to do it in some other way, but everything I've seen about it, it's just a source of pain to everybody,
Yeah.
particularly to women.
No, I agree.
So that's kind of the overview. I think everybody has to sort of come to terms with it. But I think in very real terms, it is, if the book of Abraham is the best argument against the church sort of theologically, polygamy is the best argument against Joseph Smith personally, because Joseph Smith's behavior in polygamy left quite a bit to be desired. And I don't think we do anybody any favors by trying to pretend otherwise.
I agree. I think at worst, you could view his behavior, and we'll talk about it, as some critics would, as sexual predator. I think at best, you could see he was trying to follow a commandment, and it was very messy, the implementation. And I would agree what you were saying about the inequality of polygamy. It's hard to make it sound all sunshine and roses. There are women who did testify of receiving a testimony of it, having spiritual experience. That family member, that ancestor of yours, had something positive to say, but there's many people that suffered, and it was, that book by Todd Compton, In Sacred Loneliness.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of unhappiness, a lot of sorrow and turmoil with polygamy. And one of the questions that I wrestle with the most, I don't think Jeremy asked this in the CES letter, is, you said how polygamy, it's unfair, it's unequal. Brian Hales would say it expands a man's sexual opportunities and limits a woman, and it just seems like a bad system. And I've often wrestled with the question, why would a fair, loving God command something that seems so unfair, and that causes a lot of pain? But that's not a question in the CS letter, so you don't have to answer that one.
Oh, well, I'm happy to address it to some degree. Because the more I wrestle with it, I mean, I've heard a lot of the apologetic arguments, and I've made some of the apologetic arguments. They are less and less convincing to me. My father used to say that the great thing about polygamy, when he was trying to justify it to me, because see, the thing is, polygamy was not sort of a shelf breaker for me, because it was something that my family had discussed even before, I read the God Makers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He said, look, polygamy was the glue that bound the church together in the early years, and separated the church from the world and allowed the church to survive as it sort of created a separate community out in Utah. And it was polygamy that bound us all together. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, I guess. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, if they hadn't been polygamists, how much would they have needed that kind of isolation and being bound together? Because so much of the persecution, so much of the violence, Joseph Smith's death, polygamy was at the heart of all of that. People were disgusted with Joseph Smith primarily because he was a polygamist, and they saw him as a sexual predator.
Yeah.
If that had not been a part of church history, would the saints have encountered the kind of persecution that they encountered that drove them out west? And it's impossible to play hypothetical games, because we have no idea what that church would have looked like, and this, that, and the other. But that argument ended up falling flat for me. The arguments, and certainly the arguments that, hold on, I'm sorry, my wife is yelling at me. Yeah. Anyway, no, so on my mission, it was common to tell people, well, there were so many more women than men, and as they crossed the plains, I mean, there's nothing to that. That argument is a complete and total lie.
Where they married the widows, or it was
they married the widows because women couldn't own property. I mean, nothing in that explanation holds up at all.
Yeah.
Nothing in that explanation holds up.
Brian Hale said to me, they're good answers not supported by good evidence.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, Brian Hales, I really like Brian Hales. He gets A lot of critics sort of dismiss him, but I think he really has done his homework.
Oh yeah, he knows his stuff.
He knows his stuff, and I think he has been able to sort of reconcile a lot of things in the most faith positive way.
Yeah.
But that still leaves a lot of messiness, a lot of difficulty. So, you know, where I have sort of landed on polygamy is with the concept that this, at its heart, you know, there are so many doctrines that we don't realize that we're tracing back to polygamy at the center of it. D&C 132, people talk about how much they despise it because of polygamy, but polygamy doesn't get mentioned until the very end of that revelation. Most of that revelation is focusing on, you know, the idea of us becoming gods, the ideas of us being children of God. When we sing, I am a child of God, we're singing to some degree section 132. You know, there are doctrine, I'm trying to remember what the word is, but when we become like God, theosis.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
You know, that section 130.
Deification, yeah.
Yeah, deification. And to me, those are doctrines a lot of people sort of want to downplay and dismiss. I think they're the most beautiful core of what it is I believe, and what it is that I think sets the restored gospel apart from a lot of the rest of the world. The idea that God is our Father, we can become like him. All of that is sort of wrapped up in that revelation and tied together inextricably to some degree with the doctrine of plural marriage.
Yeah.
And so where I've landed is that I think the revelation, the core of it, this idea of sealing us together as a human family with God as our Father, is a powerful, beautiful, magnificent idea for us to come together. And I think Joseph kind of screwed that up by saying, well, the only way to do that is to marry people, is to get married. That Joseph, and it becomes difficult because when you start to sort of wrestle with, okay, well, did Joseph really see an angel with a drawn sword telling him to practice polygamy? And I don't know what to do with that. I don't really know what that is. The best way I can handle Joseph Smith is in recognizing that he was a believer, that I do not think polygamy was solely a pretext for Joseph Smith to have a lot of sex. And the difficulty everybody has when they confront polygamy is that the records we have are so spotty, particularly in the Joseph Smith era. Once we get to Brigham Young and we get out into Utah and polygamy is practiced out in the open, we have all kinds of records. We still have all kinds of problems, I think. But with Joseph, he was doing this in secret. He was not keeping kinds of records. And so you have, if you want to take any kind of extreme of your position on Joseph Smith, the record will not dissuade you from doing that. For instance, if you want to believe that, he was a sexual predator and he was just out for everybody's wives and he was out to have sex with as many women as he could, there's really not a lot on the record to dissuade you from that. If you want to believe, as Meg Stout does, she's a blogger for Millennial Star, and she wrote a book that I thought was very interesting. It wasn't persuasive to me, but she wrote a book called Faithful Joseph, where she insists that Joseph had no sexual relationships with any of these women, and that he married them solely as a religious principle, was entirely faithful sexually to Emma. You can make that case. I don't think it's a persuasive case. I think there's too much evidence that some of these marriages had sexuality involved in them. But the problem is, with the amount of hard evidence we have, you can go anywhere in your extreme and paint any picture of Joseph Smith that you want to paint, and you'll have some evidence to be able to support your position. So I've landed on the idea that there was a core doctrine, there was a core principle of theosis, of becoming like our Heavenly Father, of binding the whole human family together. And Joseph went about it in probably the worst possible way he could have. And Joseph was dishonest about it, particularly with Emma. That's my biggest problem with polygamy, is his dishonesty, lying to Emma repeatedly. That he was sealed to the Partridge sisters, and then Emma said, "Hey, you can marry the Partridge sisters," and so he stages another marriage in front of Emma. That's a total lie. I mean, they've already been sealed. I don't.
It's hard to defend that. You can't justify it.
There isn't a way to defend it. I mean, if you try to defend it, if you can't have a faith that can allow for the possibility that Joseph did wrong things and bad things, maybe for the right reasons. I mean, I think Joseph genuinely believed this is what God wanted him to do.
Yeah.
And so that allowed him, I think, to rationalize a good deal of dishonesty with regard to polygamy. I do think that the public statements on polygamy are not as dishonest as critics want to say they are.
Carefully worded denials.
Joseph was walking a line between what he was doing and what John C. Bennett, who was of no relation to me, by the way, of what John C. Bennett was doing. John C. Bennett was, the phrase spiritual wifery has been conflated with plural marriage and polygamy. But I think at the time it was a different practice. John C. Bennett would go to women and say, okay, you are now my spiritual wife. So it doesn't matter who you're married to temporally, you are married to me spiritually, which means we can have sex and your husband doesn't have to know about it. And so he was using it entirely as a pretext for adultery. There was no kind of ceremony, as far as I know. And Joseph Smith's statements about polygamy are all condemning spiritual wifery.
Yeah.
And we look at that and say, oh, it's the same thing. He's condemning what he was doing. And in Joseph's mind, he was doing something else. Joseph was performing sealing ceremonies, some of which were marriages in the same sense that we consider marriages, and some of which definitely were not. They were sealings, and they were for eternity only. And they, which eternity is a whole lot longer than mortality, surely. These weren't sexual relationships in many, many cases. He never lived with any of these women as their husband, the way Brigham Young did, and the way polygamists later on did. Richard Bushman talks about he didn't practice domestic polygamy, he practiced sealing polygamy.
So that was probably in part because they were keeping it secret, wasn't
it? Because they were keeping it secret, and because he was keeping it a secret from his legal wife. Yeah. So it was kind of hard for him to slip off and have sex with all of his wives in any kind of way that would, merit describing it as a legitimate marriage. So how much of that was the fact that he just didn't have time for these women? He married elderly women who were just sealed to him, and there's not a lot of evidence that. I went and did the math, and the average age of his plural wives was about 30 years old, or a little over 30 years old.
Yeah.
So I mean, they taught you, when you start talking about, no, he was actually just chasing teenagers and young girls. There really aren't a lot of really young wives, and the ones that raised the most eyebrows were very likely non-sexual relationships. Helen Mar Kimball wrote a poem called For Eternity Only, where she describes what polygamy has done to her. And it's a tremendously heartbreaking poem, not because she had a sexual relationship with Joseph Smith. It makes it fairly clear that she did not, but because she was under the impression that this was just for eternity only, and so it wouldn't have an impact on her day-to-day life. but it had a huge impact on her day-to-day life. Boys wouldn't dance with her, and she couldn't have normal relationships with the opposite sex, and she couldn't marry in a way because nobody wanted to date a girl that was already spoken for, and
Yeah.
all of that kind of thing. So she talks about how even though the marriage itself was for eternity only, the impact of it was entirely negative here in this life. That ended up changing for her, at least her opinion and her experience. She ended up marrying Horace Whitney and having 11 children. And she was a fierce defender of plural marriage throughout her life. But right at the time when she was sealed to Joseph Smith, it was not something that she wanted to do. It was not something that she enjoyed.
It was her father's idea, wasn't it? He had
It was her
desires to
father's
be.
idea. He wanted to sort of bind their families together,
Yeah,
and sort of offered up his daughter as a gift, as property.
like
I
a
mean,
ewe lamb, I
this
think she said, like a human sacrifice.
yeah. I mean, this is the thing about polygamy, is that women were, you look at the Revelation in section 132, it's like, well, you can take as many virgins as you want, and it's like, does the virgin have anything to say about it?
Yeah,
I mean, these aren't property, these are people. And polygamy treats women as property. It just,
because
you
I
know
think there's wording in D&C 132, if I'm remembering correct, where it says like if a man desires to espouse a virgin, like almost
yeah,
like desire being like that allows it, so to speak, as long as it's done under the authority. But if you desire to take another wife, then you can.
yeah, but the women don't get any say. I mean, it's and I have a degree of sympathy to people who argue, well, we're talking presentism here because we have an egalitarian society, or at least certainly more than they did, and it really wouldn't have been surprising in the 19th century that it was entirely patriarchal, and what the man chose is what happens. But that doesn't work, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
okay, it helps us to understand why huge red flags didn't go up for some of these people, but it doesn't make it right.
yeah.
It's still a problem. So
Yeah, no, I was going to say that even though it was maybe more common than it is today for a 14-year-old to get married
yeah,
with parental permission, it was very uncommon for a 14-year-old to marry, what, he
right.
was 37 or 38. So that would have been, quite surprising. I would probably lean with you. I think there is a lack of evidence to support their marriage being consummated. I believe she continued to live with her parents. She wasn't brought forward at the 1890, what do you call that? I think with the
Temple
oral
Lot trial.
Temple Lot, yeah. She
Yeah,
wasn't brought forward, and then the Eternity Alone poem, and she defended polygamy to the end of her life. And so I think, yeah, probably the evidence might lean towards it not being consummated, although none of us can know with any
yeah.
certainty. Um, but what
And
you're saying,
legally, it could have been I mean,
yeah, it could have been,
it was performed as a legal wedding to the point where,
yeah,
if Joseph Smith had it's just, I don't even want to talk about it. It's just
yeah,
gross.
yeah. But Joseph Smith, he did marry. My numbers are about 11 teenagers
Yeah,
that he married. Some of them were like, I think Emily Partridge and Lucy Walker, Sarah Ann Whitney, and some people can be disturbed about his proposals to some of these teenage girls. I think in the case of Helen Mar Kimball, she said that she was told it would ensure like the salvation or exaltation of her family.
right.
I think in the Lucy Walker story, while the women, you could say, had a choice whenever the prophet is saying, this is a commandment to you, this doctrine, this revelation on plural marriage, do you believe I'm a prophet? Then, you must accept it. And if you do, then you'll receive exaltation. I know there's a quote in the Lucy Walker story where I think he proposed plural marriage to her. She hesitated and wrestled with it for a few months, and then he followed
Yeah,
up
the
with her. And
door
then,
will be forever closed to you.
yes, yeah. I'm pretty much giving her like a 24 hour, to make a decision. Critics would say it's like an ultimatum and it put pressure on her. What are your take on his proposals to young girls? Because as I looked through the accounts, many of them were to them individually. And sometimes I think in the case of the Partridge sisters, he like would write a letter and then he would say, burn it. And,
Yeah.
Some of that behavior is a little bit troubling,
Yeah,
when you look
no,
at it.
it's more than a little bit troubling. So there was a few years ago it was actually during Mitt Romney's presidential run in 2012. A columnist wrote this really anti-Mormon screed and talked about the Lucy Walker story in particular. That
Yeah.
Joseph Smith gave her 24 hours or she'd be damned to hell. And I went, if that were the case, I think I would have heard that before now. That was the first I'd heard about it. And I went and dug through the Lucy Walker story. And the Lucy Walker story isn't nearly as it's not that it's not problematic. All of polygamy is problematic, but that's not what happened. That's, I think, a mischaracterization of what happened. Joseph went to her, said, he made a proposal, and I'm a prophet, and you should marry me.
Yeah.
And she said, essentially, let me think about it, and thought about it for 7 to 8 months. And came back to her. And then Joseph goes to her and says, look, I've given you 7, 8 months. You got 24 hours or this door is closing. And it isn't, you've got 24 hours or you're going to burn in hell. It was, we're not going to get, here, I've made this proposal to you. You need to let me know within 24 hours or the door is closed forever on the possibility of us getting married.
Yeah.
And she responds to him then and says, well, then no, we're not going to get married. And then Joseph's response is, well, if you pray about it, you'll get a great manifestation within the next 24 hours. And she records within the next 24 hours exactly that happening. You will have the peace that you have never known, or it's some kind of anyway. So she ends up consenting that way. Now, does that mean that this wasn't a problematic exchange with a terrible power differential? It does not. This is still problematic. It's not what critics describe it as, which is Joseph goes to her, says, you have 24 hours or you're going to burn in hell because you didn't marry me. That's not what happened. People talk about the angel with the drawn sword, and they say, okay, well, Joseph went to women and said, if you don't marry me, an angel's going to kill me. And that's not what happened. Joseph did say that an angel with a drawn sword at some point came to him and said, you need to enter into plural marriage or I will kill you. It was not, you need to enter into plural marriage with X, Y, or Z person. It was, you need to, the most faithful the people willing to give Joseph the most benefit of the doubt believe that this was not something he wanted to do at all. That he did not want to be a polygamist. And so he waited years and years after Fanny Alger, after what a disaster that was. And the angel with the drawn sword had to finally convince him to go ahead and start sleeping with lots of women.
So I think is it Mary Elizabeth Rowlands Leitner? I think she says the angel visits him 3 times between 1834 to 1842. And in the heading of D&C 132, it says that the revelation was probably instigated by Joseph inquiring why the Lord justified Abraham and Isaac, Jacob. Although I don't think the Bible talks about Isaac being a polygamist, but he's included in the list. David, Solomon, because polygamy was practiced in the Old Testament. Nowhere have I seen it explicitly commanded, but you could say that it was permitted, either part of the culture or God didn't condemn polygamy throughout the Old Testament, although monogamy
throughout the Old Testament, God doesn't condemn slavery either.
Yeah, that's true.
So I get
not a good
little
argument
wary. It's like, I mean, God dealt with the people where they were and how they were, and that was sort of the cultural norm at the time. I don't know that it was a cultural norm that was enforced by revelation. Joseph believed that it was, insisted that it was, and that it needed to be restored.
The Book
I
of
have a hard
Mormon
time with it.
condemns polygamy in Jacob too, but does
Yeah.
give the wee clause that, you know, if I
If I,
will, saith the Lord,
yeah,
command my people to raise a righteous seed, then, you know, then they can, but otherwise, you know, monogamy's the standard. So there is that clause in the Book of Mormon that
yeah, and
allows the
I
door open that
cling to
God
that.
could command it.
Well, I cling to that in that uh, I look at that when I also look at statements by Brigham Young, particularly, where he talks about how you have to be a polygamist, at least in your faith, and you know, that it's like, no, the Book of Mormon makes it very clear that monogamy is the norm.
Yeah.
There have been times and places where polygamy has either been allowed or commanded, depending on where you situate. But I have no problem embracing the idea and the reality that monogamy is divine, and that monogamy is ordained of God, and it is the norm, and that polygamy is the exception, not the rule.
Yeah. What do you think of you know, David and Solomon being sort of condemned for their polygamy, you know, being considered like an abomination or I think a whoredom? And
Yeah.
then D&C 132 almost says how like they were justified in their polygamy.
Well, yeah, D&C 132 actually references the Book of Mormon language. Uh, I think Joseph recognized that he had to sort of confront that in the Revelation. And it says that they were justified, but then they sought more women than they were justified in having. And we
Right, yeah.
certainly see that in the Old Testament with Bathsheba and David.
Yeah, that's true.
And I mean,
Solomon didn't
and
he have he had hundreds of wives, I
he had
think.
hundreds of wives, and the Old Testament even talks about him going after strange women.
That's right.
And that has reference primarily to women who were not a part of Israel, not part of the covenant. He was marrying foreign women who were not part of the covenant. And so that I think, I mean, that I think is how D&C 132 sort of tries to skirt the prohibition in Jacob chapter 2 in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
I don't find it wildly convincing, to be
Mm.
honest.
It's probably the best way to try to harmonize what appears to be
I don't think you
contradictory
can
statements.
harmonize it. And
Yeah.
I think this to raise up seed unto me thing, uh, I think that's a weak argument too.
Well, people
I just don't.
criticize. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just don't. I I have spent a good deal of time trying to justify polygamy, publicly and privately, and I haven't convinced myself. You know, I haven't convinced myself that polygamy wasn't just kind of a horrible mistake.
Right.
I can find reasons for the mistake, and I can make allowances for Joseph Smith in making a mistake in good faith. That Joseph had this idea, the sealing of the human family, the good stuff in section 132, that Joseph thought that this is the only way to do it. It's interesting to me, for instance, that during Joseph Smith's lifetime, no children were ever sealed to their parents. The idea that sealing, the way we do it now in the 21st century, that evolved long after Joseph's death. People, for instance, long after Joseph had died, were still being sealed to Joseph Smith. Heber J. Grant's father, Jedediah M. Grant, my great-great-grandfather, stood proxy for Joseph Smith when he married his wife. And she was sealed to Joseph Smith, and he was the proxy. And they were married and had Heber J. But he died. Jedediah died, I think, within days of Heber J's birth. But he's not sealed. Heber J is not sealed to his biological father. He's sealed to Joseph Smith as his father. We don't do that anymore. Thank goodness. But we used to seal people to Joseph and Brigham, and that was how we did it. And we've kind of figured out, no, we don't have to marry everybody to Joseph Smith. That's not how we seal the whole human family together. We seal the human family together, father to son, daughter to mother, and in the same way that we have families now.
Yeah.
But Joseph, for instance, was also sealed to several men, clearing the way, I think, for theological justification for same-sex marriage sealings, if we wanted to go there. But
I was talking about that one a wee bit.
Well, I have a brother-in-law named Nathan Oman who wrote a long essay about this. Nate is as faithful a Latter-day Saint as you will ever find, and as orthodox a Latter-day Saint you will ever find. He's also a law professor at the College of William and Mary. Mm-hmm. And he's been doing he was kind of the head of church PR on the East Coast, which brought him into contact with Jeffrey R. Holland quite a bit. They were working together, and Jeffrey R. Holland was sort of his direct supervisor on that. And they've had long conversations about this. And Nate decided to sort of put this all together in an essay. And the essay is called A Welding Link of Some Kind by Nathan Oman. And he talks about the law of adoption that we no longer practice. The law of adoption being the idea that we are sealed and adopted into the families of church leaders. That we are sealed to Joseph Smith's family. We're sealed to Brigham Young's family. We're sealed to Wilford Woodruff's family. I think it's Wilford Woodruff that sort of put a stop to that and said, this is not how we should be doing sealings. And has changed it. And he points out that, the nuclear family as we now understand it in the 21st century, and that we insist the sealing power is designed to maintain, that's not the way it was initially practiced. It was not practiced to sort of create heavenly replicas of earthly families.
Yeah.
Because we were all being sealed to these church leaders, and that's how we were all going to be united as one family, with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young as the fathers. And you'd only have a handful of fathers, and the rest of us are all sort of children in that regard. We don't do that anymore. And I think
it's interesting, the development, isn't it? The sort of evolution of how sealings are done.
That absolutely gives us sort of theological cover to perform same-sex marriage sealings, because we don't understand how marriage is going to work in the eternities. Mm-hmm. If it's going, what about all those people that were sealed to Joseph Smith? Are they all still going to be married to Joseph Smith? Will they have the option to be married in the same way that we are married now in the 21st century? Will they have the option to be monogamists if they want to be? Because I'm assuming particularly a lot of the women are going to want to be monogamists.
And that's a fear a lot of women have, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some women in the church who are worried that if they go to the celestial kingdom, that they'll be forced to be in a polygamist.
Right. Well, you have women that are terrified that if they die before their husbands, the husbands are gonna do a Russell Nelson or a Dallin Oaks and marry somebody else and be sealed to somebody else, and then they get to the next life and surprise, you're stuck with both of us.
Yeah.
That's
what happened with my dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your dad is sealed to more than one woman?
Yeah, because my mom, she passed away 5 years ago, and he's remarried and sealed to another woman, which it can be difficult for.
How's his second wife feel about it?
I don't know. I've not talked to her about it.
Yeah. I mean that's the thing, is the second wife that I would think, I don't know. And whenever, President Oaks kind of joked about it in, I think, a somewhat inappropriate way in conference. I think we talked about that a little bit.
I remember that talk, didn't he?
And it's like, there's too much pain associated with this to be taking it that lightly.
Yeah.
I really feel like we need to respect the experiences and sort of the trauma and the difficulty of the women, particularly, who have made huge sacrifices to live this principle, which they believed came from God. I mean, you read the testimonies of the women who were married to Joseph Smith, and without exception, all of them believed very strongly that what they were doing was God's will.
Yeah.
And polygamy, you look at sort of the legacy of faith of the people who practiced it, and you see a lot of that. You see, and from the men as well. You see, you know, I am sympathetic to a degree, again, to the fact that polygamous men, they had far greater sexual opportunities. So, you know, it's not like, I mean, so okay, that's a plus, you know, but domestically, they didn't really have a place to, unless they were Brigham Young and they had a lion house where they could have all of their wives in one place. They would live in multiple households, and a lot of the records show that they were sort of invaders in their own house. Like they'd show up and they'd be there for 1 week out of the month, and that's the 1 week where they're kind of visiting, and they're messing up the whole routine because the mom and the kids and everything else, they have a life, and they've had to build a life somewhat independent of the husband. And so he comes and I mean, it's just an alienating thing for the man as well. I don't want, as much as I enjoy sex, I don't want to be a polygamist. I don't want to live that way.
Yeah, the practicality of it, the logistics,
the
seems like it's a
practicality
burden
of
for the
it, the
men as well.
logistics. I just think it would be really alienating.
Yeah.
It would be really, you know, marriage is the most intimate relationship that any human being can have. And I would think that having multiple wives like that would drive a wedge in my marriage with all of them.
Yeah.
That I can never really be fully present with each of them. And they're all, I mean, much harder for the women.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a great deal for men either. I just don't see anything really good.
I think probably some of the men saw it as a sacrifice as well as a burden in some cases. And I think when you look at polygamy, they did see it as a religious practice that they were following to be obedient. You know, some of the things you were talking about, how like polygamy, it's so interconnected with celestial marriage and, you know, sealings. Because I know Patrick Mason, I don't know if you watched him being interviewed on Mormon Stories.
I haven't watched it yet.
But I really like Patrick, a lot of respect to him, but he pretty much described polygamy as he doesn't want to put lipstick on a pig, which I think is a fair analogy. But he actually, I think, rejects D&C 132. You know, he doesn't have a fundamentalist view of scripture, and he just sees all of polygamy as just not of God. And the only problem I sort of saw with that interpretation, while I understand it, is how interconnected it is with eternal families and sealing and celestial marriage. And if you reject the NC 132, that's a core doctrinal foundation of the church. And while the church and everyone would love to just pretend polygamy didn't happen, to outright reject it, like how could you reject it and then say, oh, but you know, eternal marriage is fine in D&C 132? Like it's interconnected.
The temple sprung out of polygamy. The temple springs out of section 132. I love Patrick. I don't know him that well, but his mother is in our ward.
Oh, no way.
She's one of the most, and his father was in our ward before he passed away and was our home teacher for years and years. He spoke at my son's baptisms. The Masons are just absolutely wonderful human beings. And Patrick, I just think, is such a thoughtful, brilliant scholar. I feel the same way about people who reject section 132 as people who say that the Book of Mormon is inspired fiction. Which is to say, good for you, and there's certainly a place in the church for you, and I love and appreciate you. I don't know how you do that, because I don't think I could do that. I don't think I can reject section 132. I think I can look at section 132 and say that Joseph kind of got it wrong to some degree. But so much of section 132 is, as you say, yeah, it's our core doctrine. And I think it's beautiful doctrine. Part of the problem with section 132 is that the history of it and how Joseph wrote it up and used it just sort of like bully Emma, and how she cast the copy of it into the fire and all that.
Yeah, the language is harsh, with threats
The
of
language is so
damnation.
harsh, particularly with Emma.
Yeah.
You will be destroyed. It's kind of hard to carve out and say there's a lot of good stuff here when you know the context of how that version of it was actually written down.
Yeah.
And we talked in one of our previous things about the fact that the words of the revelation are not the revelation. Maybe that's how I do it, is that the words, you receive a revelation and you have to clothe it in language. And Joseph clothed all of his revelations in King James English. For instance, God did not speak to him in King James English. God, I believe, imparted sort of pure intelligence to him, and Joseph felt how to put that in language. And so I think you're seeing Joseph's frustration bubble up as he's taking this revelation and the beautiful parts of the revelation and adding his own human weaknesses and frailties to it, including his frustration with Emma, and just sort of barbing the revelation beyond, I think, what he should have done and what he should have intended.
Yeah,
if that
because
makes
some
sense.
people would view D&C 132 as the Lord or Joseph Smith, if you believe Joseph Smith. If it was from the Lord, it was obviously through Joseph Smith, as harsh threats of destruction and manipulation. For she must accept Joseph Smith and his plural wives, or be destroyed, and to forgive Joseph his trespasses, which indicates that he, obviously had sinned against Emma. Maybe that's referring to him keeping it secret from her. Jeremy also points to in D&C 132, we've not talked about polyandry, but that, it says that the justification is to marry virgins who aren't vowed to other men, so women who aren't married. But then Joseph was sealed to around 13, 14 women who had living legal husbands. Brian Hales would lean towards those were sealings. They weren't time and eternity, they weren't consummated. There's no strong evidence to support that. What would be your take on sealings?
I think Brian Hales, I know Todd Compton and Brian Hales, this is probably the area where they disagree the most.
Yes, I did an interview with Todd Compton. He sees it as their marriages, and
they were marriages. Joseph was section 132 very clearly condemns polyandry. So you look at that and you say, okay, why would if Joseph is making this up, if this is just Joseph trying to justify giving himself an opportunity to have sex with as many women as he wants, why would he make up these sort of labyrinthine rules that prevent him from doing that? L. Ron Hubbard at one point wrote on a piece of paper, "All men are your slaves," to himself. Joseph could just as easily, if he were making it up, have written, "All women are yours to do with what you will," kind of thing, right? But he didn't. He sort of framed it with these rules, and people go, he was breaking his own rules. That, to me, argues for the fact that in Joseph's mind, he wasn't, which would suggest that whatever was happening with him and these polyandrous relationships wasn't in violation of section 132. And the only way that could be the case is if these are sort of eternity-only sealings. I really do think Brian Hales has done great work here and has even convinced Todd Compton that at least some of them were. Todd Compton initially said, no, none of them are. They're all just marriages and there's no difference. And there's one husband. A lot of these husbands knew about the sealing to Joseph Smith. It was, we don't know about all of them. Again, the records are so spotty. But we have cases where the husband, yes, they know that the woman's being sealed to Joseph Smith, and the woman continues to live with her husband. Now, that argues very, very strongly that this husband recognizes that whatever that is with Joseph Smith, it isn't a sexual relationship. That's confined to these marriages. The strongest evidence against that is Sylvia Sessions, who tells her daughter, I think it's a daughter.
Josephine.
I'm sorry, what?
Josephine. I tells her daughter.
Josephine, yeah, tells Josephine that she's not really the, she's not really the daughter of
I was
her
Windsor
legal husband,
Lion.
but she's the daughter of Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
But they've done DNA work to show that isn't true. Joseph did not father any children with his plural wives, as far as we can tell, which again has been sort of blown out of proportion by those trying to defend Joseph, saying, "See, there was no sex." And
calls
no, I
into
don't think it does
question
that.
how much sex was happening. Some people speculate there's not good evidence for it, but maybe abortions were happening to hide it if it was kept secret. I suppose that's a possibility. Not strong evidence to support it.
I think there's a lot of good evidence against it.
Mm-hmm.
I had that because I got into a Twitter war with somebody on that. Because John C. Bennett was an abortionist and he performed abortion. Problem is, the vast majority of Joseph Smith's wives were married after John C. Bennett had been kicked out of Nauvoo. John C. Bennett, there's really kind of an 8-month window where John C. Bennett could have been Joseph's personal abortionist, if you will.
And most of his early marriages were polyandrous, so if the women did get pregnant, there wouldn't have been as much of a need to cover it, to hide it.
That's true.
Through an abortion, I think, was it maybe just Louisa Beeman and one other, maybe a couple others, until John C. Bennett got kicked out. So yeah, I know what you mean. That, yeah.
Well, but people argue that Joseph, prior to sort of trying to legitimize his adultery with plural marriage, is how they would describe it, was sleeping around all over the place anyway. That he and John C. Bennett were just sort of
in cahoots,
two men about town, bedding women right and left, and then John C. Bennett would clean up after everything. I think that would have left a historical record that we don't have. And that kind of abortion on that kind of a scale, somebody would have said something, and nobody does. We just don't have any evidence of that at all. And I think in this case, absence of evidence is, in fact, evidence of absence, because abortion, particularly in the 19th century, was such a traumatic, medically dangerous, so far removed from safe abortions that we now have in the 21st century, that I don't think you would have had multiple abortions with multiple women where nobody ever talks about it ever again.
The pain would have been excruciating, probably like unbearable.
Well, the pain would have been excruciating, and the stigma would have been excruciating, and most of these women would likely have been left sterile as a result. We just don't have any evidence of that, and we should have evidence of that if that were actually happening.
Yeah.
So I'm not persuaded by that at all. I think what it means is that Joseph did not really have much of an opportunity to sleep with all of his wives, as much as probably he would have liked to. I bet marrying these young girls, he probably was like, woohoo, this is great. But there was a lot going on in Joseph Smith's life at that time.
That's true.
That would have prevented him from having these relationships. Yet it did not prevent him from continuing to father children with Emma.
Yeah.
Which kind of indicates again that the sexual relationship with Emma was really sort of the priority there, and that Joseph saw Emma differently from all of these other women that he was marrying. I don't know if that's better or worse for an indictment of his character, that he sees all these wives as sort of secondary people or property to some degree.
So
But
he would feel better if he's more loyal, so to speak, to his first wife.
if he's more loyal to Emma, I mean, he was clearly loyal to Emma, and she was clearly loyal to him.
Yes, yeah, she was.
Throughout his life, even to the end of his life. After he dies, Emma is absolutely devastated. And they tell her, well, you get to wear a crown of glory in the eternities. And her response is, my husband was my crown. And even after she ends up getting remarried to a guy who, in the bitterest of ironies, ended up being unfaithful to her. But she continues to be loyal to Joseph and loyal to the Book of Mormon. She hates Brigham Young, hates him with
Yeah,
a passion, and won't go west. But the loyalty was on both sides, and it lasted throughout their life, and it endured through polygamy, which is really astonishing if you think about it. And it makes it harder to sort of write off Joseph as just this predatory, hey there, hi there, ho there. There's something more going on with polygamy, and there's something more going on with Joseph than the critics are willing to allow.
yeah,
That does not, I think, let Joseph off the hook for many, many things that he did that continue to be troubling to this day.
yeah. No, I think it definitely shows that she still believed in his prophetic call, that he was a prophet. Just finishing off with polygamy, I think we've talked about it quite thoroughly. But Jeremy would say, really, what's the difference between Joseph Smith's polygamy, Warren Jeffs' polygamy? When you look at it maybe on the surface, you can see similarities to marrying teenage girls. Warren Jeffs married teenage girls. I think Warren Jeffs practiced polyandry as well. I know I think on a bigger scale, he had a lot more wives than Joseph Smith. And if you watch the, what was it, Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey,
Oh yeah, so disturbing.
that was horrific how
Yeah.
disturbing that was. And if I remember thinking in my head, like, if I went back in a time machine, if that's what Joseph Smith was doing, like, yeah, no way that's of God. And any response to that? Like, because people might
Yeah,
make the
I'm trying to remember
connection.
what I said to Jeremy, but um, I lived in St. George for 3 years, and you would see polygamists and FLDS women and a handful of men in Walmart and in Costco. They would show up with their hair that they're not allowed to cut for some reason, and in the plain dresses and all of that. And I remember asking my father, it's like, why do they do that? Because isn't your mother, she's the daughter of a polygamist? Uh, was that the case of polygamy? Did they have to behave that way time of Joseph Smith? And his response was no, not at all. In fact, women that were polygamous women in early Utah were very sort of autonomous and kind of had to be, because they had to set up households and run them in the absence of men. They ended up sort of just becoming the kind of submission that Warren Jeffs demanded was alien to what polygamists in pioneer Utah would have had to have experienced. All of those weird sort of accoutrements came after the FLDS split with the mainstream church. And I think the kind of things that Warren Jeff did, where it wasn't polyandry, it was, hey, I'm taking your wife. I am reassigning your wife to me. We don't have evidence of Joseph Smith doing that. He came close with Heber C. Kimball, where he did this sort of Abrahamic test,
Yeah,
but ended up did not take Valake Kimball as his wife, and was testing Heber. I think that in and of itself is kind of awful.
I
That
agree.
test, though, demonstrates that Joseph saw that was a line that was inappropriate to cross. The idea of just taking somebody's wife.
Some
And
people
Joseph,
feel like he did
for
that
all of
though
his
with Orson Hyde.
uh, the Orson Hyde. So the Orson Hyde incident scenario is fraught with contradictory evidence. It is not entirely clear what happened there. And Sarah Marinda Hyde ends up being sealed to Orson Hyde and not to Joseph Smith. It's I mean, Joseph denied it, but he was accused of it, insisted he didn't do it, and I just don't know what to do with it. I don't think it's nearly as clear as, we just don't have enough records to definitively say what that is. I mean, from the broader perspective, I think Joseph, proposed marriage to all these women and took no for an answer from some of them.
Yeah.
And Warren Jeffs, it didn't take, I mean, it wasn't even a question of taking no for an answer. It's that women are property to be assigned however Warren Jeffs wants them, which I think is a significant difference.
He's a bit of a tyrant, the way he was doing it.
Warren Jeffs was a tyrant in a way that I don't see Joseph's. I mean, I think you can make more of an argument that Brigham Young was more Warren Jeffs-like. I mean, Brigham Young was more authoritarian in how he practiced polygamy. But I still think that Warren Jeffs, it becomes clear that women just are entirely property in a way that they weren't, that they couldn't have been in Pioneer, Utah.
Yeah.
So, again, that doesn't let Joseph Brigham or anybody off the hook. It just says, I just think that once the FLDS church broke away from the mainstream, it doubled down on the worst aspects of polygamy. And there really aren't a lot of good aspects of polygamy, but it doubled down on this idea that women are property that can be distributed at the whim of the president of the church.
Right. And if I'm understanding you correctly, just overview on polygamy, so I'm representing you correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong. You believe that Joseph Smith sincerely believed that he was commanded and to restore polygamy, restoration of all things. But you leave open the possibility that he may not have been commanded by God, that polygamy was a mistake.
Well, I'm open to that possibility, but my feeling is that it was both. That it was, he receives this revelation to seal the human family together, and the mistake was, oh, that means I need to marry lots and lots of women.
Right.
That his interpretation of the revelation was distorted by his own weaknesses and frailties.
Right.
And temptations.
Okay. And okay, so transitioning sort of from polygamy to prophet. So, well, in 1890 was the Manifesto. I don't know if you've heard of this. This was actually quite new to me until I sort of dived into polygamy a little bit deeper. In 1886, John Taylor gave a revelation because the church was getting so much persecution and opposition practicing polygamy, and leaders were getting put in prison. And in 1886, John Taylor gave this revelation sort of in the voice of God.
What do you mean gave the revelation? Because that's important.
I think he wrote it, didn't he?
He wrote a revelation. It was never presented to the church as a revelation. And there are still those who try to say that it's
forged
or spurious. I don't think so. I think he wrote it. And again, I think he believed it.
Yeah.
That said, he never presented it to the church, which means we are not bound by it. So again, if Joseph can write section 132 and take some actual revelatory information and filter it through his own weaknesses and come out with something flawed, I think exactly the same thing can happen to anybody, including John Taylor. And my sense is that John Taylor absolutely believed that plural marriage could never disappear, and whatever revelation he got, he couched it in those terms, he interpreted in those terms.
Right.
But could it have been that he did that and then realized that was a mistake to do that, which is why he never presented it to the church? That's kind of where I situate. That's where I land on it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that he wrote it down and went, no, that's not really right, and left it there. But people find it, they read it, and they assume that Jesus came and dictated it to him, and so therefore the church is kind of hiding it. But the person who hid it is John Taylor himself.
Mm.
He did not introduce it to the church. So I think there's a reason for that, and the reason is that he knew it was probably overstepping what it was the Lord actually wanted or believed.
Okay. So then 1890, that's when the Manifesto happened, Wilford Woodruff given the inspired statement, to stop practicing polygamy. We don't have to get into it, but
well, it's not an inspired
continued.
statement. I mean, read it. If you read the official Declaration 1, it does not read like a revelation. It does not claim revelation.
I would agree with you. I think the church would say it's an inspired statement or declaration.
Well, this gets into, and I got into this with RFM on Mormon discussions or Mormonism Live. This gets into the difference, at least in my mind, between inspiration and revelation. Because when people in the church talk about revelation, they talk about it as if it is something that happens independent of humanity, that it is God opening the heavens and dropping a piece of information in pure, undeniable form that can't be misinterpreted or that is perfect and flawless. I don't think such a thing really exists in a fallen world. I think inspiration, if you use the term inspiration in the church, they don't apply that same high standard to it usually. It's usually, okay, I'm inspired to do something, but how I do it and how is kind of up to me, right? At its core, there's a piece of information from God that I'm inspired to act on. So I think inspiration is what comes to prophets in that kind of a form, not sort of the Bible arriving by fax from heaven, which is what people sort of see it as. So I can see John Taylor receiving inspiration, writing down that revelation, clothing it in language, not being entirely comfortable with presenting it to the church and setting it aside. And then people later on taking it and going, oh, wait a minute, John Taylor got a revelation. So, ta-da. I just don't think it works that way.
Okay. So moving on to talking about prophets. So
yeah,
last week in Sunday school, I felt a wee bit like a black sheep because the lesson was about following the prophet, and a lot of the typical phrases were said about always follow the prophet. He always
never leads you
speaks the
astray,
truth,
always
never
teaches
leads
the
you
truth.
astray, all those things. And somebody who knows about many controversial things in church history or times where prophets have said things which have been either considered false doctrine or which just seem morally and ethically wrong.
Right.
It can be quite hard to go back to that prior belief that was quite simplistic, that was quite literalistic, that
and quite wrong.
Quite wrong.
I mean, quite contrary to what we know about the restored gospel. The idea of prophetic infallibility is incompatible with the doctrine of agency. And RFM actually called me out on this in a way that has been very helpful to me since. Because I always talk about it, I use the term prophetic infallibility, and he uses the term doctrinal inerrancy.
Yeah, I like that.
And I think his term is better to some degree because when we talk about prophetic fallibility, we couch doctrinal inerrancy within it. In other words, we say, yeah, the prophet's imperfect. The prophet can have bad breath. The prophet can, forget your birthday. The prophet can misspell your name. The prophet
I might get annoyed, sometimes.
Might get annoyed, or he might. I mean, so all these things. But then they say, but he's still the prophet, and so when he gets up to a pulpit, then he is doctrinally inerrant.
Yes.
The prophet cannot say or do something at the pulpit teaching doctrine that is not 100% true, 100% correct. He can never lead you astray, whether by mine own voice, the voice of my servants, it is the same. Ta-da.
Yeah.
And it's like, nobody cares if the prophet has bad breath. When I'm talking about prophetic fallibility, nobody cares that a prophet can, isn't a perfect speller. Or I mean, that's not what anybody is talking about. The
Yeah.
only thing they're worried about him making a mistake is as a leader of the church, can he do something that is a mistake? And the answer has to be yes. Or the prophet has had his agency removed from him. The prophet standing in a pulpit or in whatever circumstance has his agency extracted and is taken over by God and is incapable of doing anything wrong. That flies in the face of the most basic of our doctrines, the doctrine of agency. So it can happen. It does. I mean, I've had these conversations with people, and it's just amazing the kind of gymnastics people do to say a prophet, okay, yeah, prophets aren't infallible, and then tell me all the reasons why prophets are infallible. I was talking to my nephew once, and I said, you don't think that God can call a person that can make a mistake to be president of the church? And he says, well, he can, he just never has. And I
Right.
was like,
Oh, wow.
what does that mean? He never has? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And the danger of teaching that doctrine is that when you encounter Brigham Young saying, talking about blood atonement or talking about, I mean, Adam God is weird in and of itself, but it's not nearly as troubling as him saying that the law of God is that, if you mix your seed with the seed of Cain, the law of God is death on the spot.
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
Well, okay, so what do you do with that statement if you can't say it's wrong? If you can't say Brigham Young was absolutely wrong, you got to find some way to justify murder of interracial couples. I don't want to justify murder of interracial couples.
I suppose an Orthodox person might say, well, maybe God did feel about that at the time, and then he's changed his mind with the,
So why are we so what you end up saying then is that God is the racist? That God is I mean, I don't understand why we are so eager to attribute racism to God instead of Brigham Young.
Yeah,
And
I think
to
that's more
me,
troubling.
it's like, you want to worship a God that wants to kill interracial couples? That's the God you adore and you want to worship and become like? It's not a God I want to become like.
Yeah.
I don't want anything to do with that kind of a God. Racism to me is always of man. It is never of God. And the only way that can be the case is by recognizing that God uses flawed and weak human vessels to do his work. And we get sort of broad acknowledgments of that in conference every once in a while. Less and less, actually, recently. President Nelson has not sort of given those in the way that you saw President Uchtdorf during Monson's administration give those.
Actually, I have a quote. This is from your CES Letter response where he said, this is President Uchtdorf, there have been times where prophets have simply made mistakes. And he says that there's been times where they've said or done things which aren't in harmony with the church's teachings, policy, or even doctrine. And that was probably one of the first, or maybe the only general conference talk that's acknowledged that they have been doctrinally wrong at times as well. There's been things said and done which has been wrong, which is, I think it's good that they're acknowledging that, because I would agree with you. Whenever I first went through my faith crisis and I lost my testimony, people would often say to me, well, prophets aren't perfect. And it really irritated me because I was like, I never claimed they were in the first place. Like, I remember on my mission, President Nelson visited, so he was president of the Quorum of the 12, and he gave a incorrect scripture citation. Like, it was only something small, but I noticed at the time, I was like, that's not the right scripture citation. And I was like, I thought he would have known that being a prophet, but that doesn't invalidate him
Right.
being a prophet. But then if they claim to, speak for God and to receive revelation to lead and guide the church, that they are his mouthpiece, so to speak, and then they were to give revelation or doctrine that is wrong at times, then I think the big question is, well, how do we know when they're right? If they've been wrong, when Brigham Young was wrong when he taught Adam is our Father and our God, and he taught it from the pulpit, and it was in the temple, it was, part of the endowment ceremony, like that's pretty big. Like like I had this conversation with my bishop, and he said, well, Brigham Young was speaking as a man, and I was like, okay, he may have been. I was like, but the problem or the issue I have is Brigham Young believed he was speaking as a prophet when he taught Adam God theory. And I was like, the question that a lot of people struggle with is, how do you know then if he thinks he's speaking as a prophet, but it's false doctrine, then how do you know that? How can you trust them on anything else? And I think that's really the core of what Jeremy's saying when it comes to, the teachings of, the priesthood ban or
Yeah.
blood atonement or Adam God theory. If they can be wrong about revelation and doctrine, how can we trust them with other things? I know that's a huge question. I think it's the big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I want to go back to what your bishop said, that Brigham Young was speaking as a man. I hate that explanation.
Yeah.
Because at, at, at what point did Brigham Young, was he not a man when he spoke?
Yes,
There
yeah,
is never
exactly.
a
He's always a
time when a
man.
prophet is not a man.
Yeah.
And so when you try to sort of parcel out, this is what he said as a man, this is what he said as a prophet, you're making a distinction that the Lord never makes. That the Lord, that we're never, there is never a time when Brigham Young sets aside his humanity, when he sets aside his fallibility and his weakness.
Mm.
There is never a moment when he is not speaking as a man. He is always speaking as a man, even when he is speaking as a prophet. And that requires us to reframe what we mean when we say he is speaking as a prophet. A
Yeah.
prophet has the authority to speak for God, but a prophet is not God. And therefore, a prophet is capable of making errors that God would not make. So then you start asking, well, how can we know? And the answer is all over the scriptures. The answer is by the power of the Holy Ghost. Ye may know the truth of all things.
Mm.
In other words, you have both the right and the responsibility to determine when what a prophet is saying is directly from God, or how much of what a prophet is saying is from God. The prophet's role is to connect you to God. It
Yeah.
is not to stand as an intermediary between you and God. So a prophet says something, you have, I mean, it's Nephi talking to his brothers. Have you inquired of the Lord? Nephi saying, well, they told my father told me about this dream. I want to know about it, and gets it directly from the Lord. You have both the right and responsibility to take whatever a prophet says and bring it to the Lord yourself and say, how does this apply to me in my life? What
Yeah,
does
I
this
agree with that.
mean? And so many people want to punt their agency off to Russell Nelson
Mm.
and not really have that responsibility anymore.
What would you
That to
say?
me is entirely contrary to, I mean, isn't that the plan we rejected? Is that somebody else gets to tell us exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, so we'll never make a mistake? That's not why we came here. We came here to make mistakes. And we came here to establish a direct relationship with God, with our own Father. And I say it over and over again, but we have, every single person on this planet has as much direct access to heaven as Russell M. Nelson does. Every single one of us. And every single one of us has the responsibility to determine what's true and what isn't. So how can we trust a prophet? The same way we trust anybody on anything, because every single person here, no matter what their expertise, how do I trust the doctor when I know that at some point they may have misdiagnosed something? How do I trust everything else? We put a prophet in a different category and say, well, if he's speaking for God, then he can never make mistakes. And that's never, ever been the way it has worked, ever. The prophets in the Old Testament made mistakes all over the place. Prophets in the Old Testament, Jacob, I think, is pretty much a terrible human being in terms of, lying to Esau and doing all this other stuff and wrestling with angels. And these are not, we hold the prophet up as if they are God. And I think that scriptures condemn that all over the place. Trust not in the arm of flesh. Russell Nelson doesn't save me. Jesus saves me.
Right.
God saves me. Russell Nelson points me to them. Russell Nelson helps direct me to them. Russell Nelson, is on my team, is sort of the leader of the team to help us win, but he's not God. And worshiping Russell Nelson is I think one of the quickest ways to get way off track in terms of what it is we ought to be doing to bring ourselves closer to God.
Okay, I've got a couple of thoughts. So there was a talk by Elder Renlund at the last general conference.
Yeah.
And essentially, my understanding of what he was saying, and I think there's some logical sense to it. If we're all claiming revelation, which isn't in harmony with doctrine or what the leaders are saying, then there would be sort of chaos and all these splinter groups. So they're saying that for it to be a true revelation, it must coincide with what the Lord has already revealed. So if you receive a revelation that doesn't coincide with what the prophets are teaching or what they're revealing, then therefore it is not of God. Now, I understand that, because then it's like that sort of gives you like this framework to know if it could be of God or not. But then when you take into account that prophets can be wrong sometimes, then I see that as a problematic framework. Like, for example, hypothetically, if we were back under Brigham Young and he was teaching Adam is our father and our God, and your personal authority, your personal revelation, your understanding of doctrine is telling you, no, he's wrong. That's not right. This feels wrong. But then if you're being told, well, you must hearken to what the prophet is saying, the prophet won't lead you astray. You're obviously deceived if you're believing something, against what he's saying. And I think it's kind of like a problem, that it's convenient that our revelation must align with his. So I do agree with you, but I know an Orthodox member would say, no, if you're receiving a revelation that's against what the prophet is saying or claiming, then you're in the wrong.
I didn't like that talk very much for a number of reasons. Elder Renlund, I think, is very bright and has given some wonderful talks. This was not one of them, in my opinion.
Okay.
But I think there is some truth and value in it as far as it goes.
Like God would be contradictory, so to speak.
Well, no.
Order.
I think what I get out of that has value to me is if you get revelation that is contrary to what you are hearing from the church. I do think there are boundaries for, the fact that he had to address Laban demonstrates how problematic his own thesis is, because Laban totally undermines his thesis, right?
Yeah.
Because his thesis, he kept talking about, like, well, what if I want to pray to say I don't want to go to church because church is so boring and I want to go worship in the mountains, but I want credit for going to church? The Lord will say, I've already revealed my will. You should not ask because you already know.
And somebody could make the same argument, then why would Joseph Smith, why would he have asked about polygamy if
right,
the scriptures that say monogamy is the standard? Then he shouldn't have inquired because he already knows what God's will is.
Right. But Laban, Nephi knew that murdering people is not okay. knew very clearly, and yet got a very clear revelation that he was supposed to do this. And Elder Renlund kind of had to say, well, so here's what I find value in it. If you receive revelation that makes you an exception to a rule, which is, I think, the way it works sometimes.
Yeah.
I think, for instance, a woman in the 1960s being told from the pulpit, never, ever, ever leave the house, never go work outside the home. You need to stay home and support your husband and be there with your children. I think a woman who gets a revelation, no, your circumstance is different. You need to go and do something about this. I think it only becomes a problem if you try to take that and say that is binding on the whole church. Does that make sense? So if I receive a revelation that's like, well, no, this what they're saying right here, this doesn't apply to my circumstance, which is different, and God and I are good on this, and so I'm going to do this. But if I go out and start preaching that the church is wrong and needs to change the broader standard, that's when I think I get into trouble. And I think Elder Renlund has a point there in sort of, there is a boundary and there is an order for how revelation can be received that is binding on the whole church.
Yeah.
So I have very strong feelings, and I feel have very sort of revealed things that inform my position on LGBTQ issues.
Yeah.
And were I to stand up and demand that the church abide by those, I would be way out of line. And that would be wrong and inappropriate. That does not mean, to me anyway, that what I believe I've received in terms of revelation is illegitimate or wrong or inappropriate. It's the result of years of soul searching and years of prayer and years of study. But it's for me. It's not for the whole church. I would like it to be for the whole church, but that's not appropriate. There is a boundary. And those of us that choose to continue to participate in the church, even as we recognize things that frustrate us or things with which we disagree, also have to recognize that's a boundary that we have to be aware of. And I mean, when RFM kept trying to push me to say things that would get me in trouble, it's like, I know there's a boundary there. I know that I can't do that. That does not mean, at least to me, that I can't believe what I believe.
Yeah.
And that I can't receive direct revelation. And I don't think Elder Renlund or anybody else has a right to police my one-on-one relationship with God. He has a right to police my relationship with God as it affects the broader church.
Yeah.
He has authority that I do not have. I can't claim to speak for the church in a way that he can. So I think that's a valuable part of what he was saying. But this idea, I mean, I'm of the opinion, ask God whatever you want about anything. Elder Renlund also is like, we shouldn't be asking for revelation on Heavenly Mother. Or he's like, we can't demand revelation on Heavenly Mother. It's like, my conversations with God, they get loud, they get heated sometimes. They're not just me sitting in King James language, dear Heavenly Father, we thank thee, we ask thee. I've reached a point now where I feel like if God is my Father, God is someone I can go to in my hour of direst need. There isn't anything he doesn't know about me. So there shouldn't be any limit to what I can discuss with him.
Yeah.
And what he chooses to tell me, that's between me and him. The minute I start saying that it's between me and the whole church is the minute that I'm way out of line.
Yeah, because the church is, um, there's that talk. I'm sure you've read it, or listened to it, the one on activism towards or against the church, and that we
Yeah.
shouldn't be, publicly advocating for things which are against the church because it can undermine faith and trust in the leaders, and if they are the Lord's servants, then we could be weakening faith, and sort of like, who are we to, if it's God's kingdom, who are we to demand change, even if we feel like we're in the right for activism? Because I think we all would agree that activism has been really good in societies, the things that it's achieved, but the church's
I think you can
position,
argue that it's also been good for the church.
I would agree with that. I think you can also see examples of changes made being influenced, or the catalyst was the members or people speaking against, certainly, the civil rights movement. And I think I read as well, LeGrand Richards talked about in Brazil, they needed black men to help run the temple, and if they didn't have the priesthood, that was a problem. So there was all those things that certainly were a catalyst to the revelation, if you can still believe it was revelation, but it definitely did not happen in a vacuum. I think the reversal of the 2015
Yeah.
policy on the children of gay parents, I think the backlash of so many people leaving the church, probably more people committing suicide, I think that definitely had to have had an impact on them, re-discussing it, praying about it again. Some people pointed that as well, that's kind of problematic. God gave a revelation in 2015, then it was reversed in 2019. Did God change his mind? Was it never revelation in the first
Or did we
place?
make a mistake?
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
that's
that's, I really hoped and actually believed foolishly that when that policy was reversed, that would start a significant conversation,
yeah.
because that was so clearly a mistake
Oh yeah.
that was reversed, that that it's undeniable. I
And
mean,
your personal authority, because you told me, I can't remember if it was in the first episode or off air, that
yeah,
you knew, you felt it was wrong, and you were
yes,
kind of against the policy, and you were close
yes.
to feeling like you needed to leave the church, but
That's
you
the
stayed
closest
in.
I came to leaving the church. Yes, and in fact, and it's also the most critical I've ever been of the church, because at the time I said, "This is wrong. This
Yeah.
is absolutely wrong." I can point to you to a whole, and everybody did point to all the reasons why it was wrong. Second article of faith: we believe that men will be punished for their own sins. You're punishing children for who their parents are. Suffer the little children to come unto me. I mean, this idea that and then the arguments in favor of it just drove. I remember I was talking to one of my best friends who was arguing, "No, God will make it all right. It's okay. They'll wait till they're 18." And I said, "All right, 2 months ago, my friend, could you have imagined that you would be defending the idea that it's not a big deal for someone to go through their entire adolescence without the gift of the Holy Ghost? That doesn't matter, that you can wait until you're 18 to be baptized, and all of those blessings that you rely on as in your formative years, you don't have to be a member of the church to have those. Those don't really matter." That's not what I'm saying. That's exactly what you're saying. It's exactly what you're saying. You're
Yeah.
trying to justify something that is wrong. And it was so frustrating, because as I said that publicly, the reaction I got publicly and privately to some degree was, "Well, get lost, leave, get out of here. We don't want you in this church anymore." And I was flabbergasted, because
Yeah.
I've spent my life in this church. I've devoted my life to this church. I'm a sixth generation member. Whatever kind of bona fides anybody wants to give, I had them. And my first sign of disagreement was, "Well, hit the road, get lost." And I'm like, that's not the sign of a healthy organization. That's not how we should treat people who have doubts or frustrations. I didn't want to get lost. I love this church and I wanted to stay.
Yeah.
And so many people want to stay. I mean, they have a faith crisis. The reason it's a crisis is because they don't want to leave. They
Yeah.
love this
Yeah.
church. This church has been a huge blessing, and they're desperate to find a way to stay. And our reaction to them is, "Well, get lost,
Yeah.
leave." And that's a huge problem that we can't address. So I mean, that
Because
talk about activism toward the church, I just thought it's such an immature idea. it's this idea that the church is so fragile and that faith is so fragile that anytime it's challenged, someone's going to crumble. It's like if your church is so fragile and delicate that somebody expressing disagreement of any kind is going to undermine faith. What kind of faith is that? What's your faith in? Your faith should be healthy and robust enough to engage with people who disagree with you. I mean, I see this just as a problem we have in the church overall. It's this idea that we can, don't read church history, don't, stay away from all of that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, here's the thing is that maybe 50 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, when I was a missionary, you had a choice as to whether or not you were going to confront difficult issues in the church.
Yeah, you probably had to go actively seeking for it.
You had to go actively seeking, which I did, and triggered my own faith crisis. But today you have no choice. We have no choice as a church. We are going to encounter activism, whether within the church or out of the church. And the thing is about activists in the church, they love the church. They want the church to improve. And there are boundaries as to how much they can do. But just, and I think it's legitimate to be able to sort of set what those boundaries are.
I suppose there's a difference between
absolutely nothing. Just let us be led by the Lord, and you don't participate. You don't get a say. You don't get a voice. Sit down, shut up, let us drive this bus. That doesn't work. It just doesn't work on any level. It doesn't work on a ward level. If a bishop says, sit down, shut up to the rest of the ward, I'm going to lead the ward. It's the reason we have ward councils. It's the reason. But the thing is, those kinds of disagreements are kept behind closed doors, and you don't have them sprawling out in the open. So maybe that's what Elder Corbett is talking about.
Suppose they don't want to give the image that it's bought, or they want to seem like it's top down revelation. It's coming from the Lord to them, and that they're not giving into societal pressure or what. We're not making the cheat, like the members.
Yeah, but that's never. I mean, I never understood that. I've never understood that, because we're taught over and over again that that's how revelation came. It came because the reason we have a polygamy revelation is Joseph Smith read about polygamy and was curious about it and wanted to know and asked the question. You ask the question when there is a need for an answer. You don't ask a question in a vacuum. I keep using this example, but in primary, I was taught the reason we have the word of wisdom was that Emma was sick to death of cleaning tobacco stains out of the wood floors. Okay, well, isn't that activism? Emma's not the prophet, but she's going to the prophet saying, we got a problem. You got a problem. This is bad. Ask the Lord. And then we get revelation. That revelation came as the result of somebody other than a prophet asking a question, and a prophet responding to the people he's supposed to serve.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why we try to pretend that isn't the case. It is always the case. Every single time we have received revelation. Spencer Kimball would not have received revelation about the priesthood if it had not been on the minds of every single member of the church. And it's one of the reasons why that doctrine went unchallenged for over a century. It didn't occur to anybody in the church at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, that Black people could be equal with white people. I mean, it just wasn't even a thing. Of course, they're second class. Of course, they can't have the priesthood. I mean, but it wasn't until people start asking about it and are complaining about it and are frustrated with it that we start taking it to the Lord. I mean, that has always been the way it has worked. It's the way the children of Israel worked with Moses. And they sent him up to the mountain because we want to know what God wants us to do. I mean, that's exactly how it's supposed to work. And I don't understand the need to pretend otherwise. I don't understand why someone would stand up and say, the decisions we make are not at all influenced by any concerns in the church. That doesn't make any sense. I
think you
don't know
can
why we
see,
want to do that.
yeah, and you can see examples in the church's history, like with the, you know, black men being allowed to hold the priesthood and black women, they could go to the temple. Even, when you look at maybe Sam Young's activism, and then the church
Right.
has now allowed, parents to be in interviews with children, or,
That's a direct response to Sam Young. For
yeah,
anybody to say otherwise, how can it not be a direct response to Sam Young? You're trying
yeah,
to tell me that happened independent of this very public attack on the church?
yeah. You talked about in the last episode, was it 1990 they removed um
Penalties.
the penalties, and that was probably in reaction to, people being disturbed by it. Even whenever I went back to the temple after coming back to the church, they removed, sort of, you could say, sexist elements of the endowment ceremony, and there was the ordained women movement, and women can now, I think they can witness baptisms and they can pray and at conference and things. So you could see that there's certainly probably been some influence by it, even with the whistleblower of the church's 100 billion. They have an
Right.
endowment peak fund, and that they should be giving more to humanitarian aid. And then in this past year, they've donated substantially a lot more. And to me, it definitely seems like certainly those things have influenced changes. And the understanding I have of Elder Corbett's talk is he's pretty much saying, like, it's, even if you're right in sort of disagreeing with the church, the method or the approach of campaigning or speaking against or advocating for change, that's wrong. But there's a correct method, like talk to your priesthood leader. Like, it's okay to disagree with them, just don't publicly speak out against. Go to your priesthood leader if you oppose or if you have an issue. That's sort of the way to go. Now, with regards to so I don't want to try. I'm not trying to get you to admit to anything, but talking about how you feel about the LGBTQ. I know you're not going to campaign or advocate against, but you have your own personal views. Do you believe and do you feel that gay marriage should be, or maybe, or might be in the future, um, allowed or sanctioned? You can definitely see a change in the rhetoric, right? Like, whenever I looked at some of the old teachings of prophets towards people who are homosexual, like, it's horrific. Like, I remember whenever I read The Miracle of Forgiveness, I remember I read the chapter on homosexuality and I was like, well, at least I'm not gay. Like, that could be worse. And at least they've softened their tone, and they say it's more about chastity. Um, you know, do you feel like the church, would you want them to sort of allow gay marriage in the church, like, so LGBT people don't have to feel like they must be celibate or leave? Because certainly, as I've listened to stories of people who are gay, like, it's you can't help but feel terrible for them. Like, they feel marginalized, they experience trauma either trying to lead a celibate life, or if they have a mixed faith marriage, or if they try to pray it away, so to speak, and it doesn't work for a lot of people. We've seen David Archuleta has just sort of publicly made his statement that he stepped away from the church.
Yep.
Without making you feel like I'm not trying to trip you up or say the church is wrong and they must change, but anything you want to share in your feelings about
Sure.
LGBTQ people?
Sure. So there's a line I won't cross, and that line is telling the church what it ought to do,
Yeah.
or specifically prescribing what the church will do.
Yes, of course.
I will say that the church has not just changed its tone, the church has drastically changed what we teach
Yeah.
about gay people.
Yeah, that's true.
And it is foolhardy to assume that the changes have stopped. This is it. We have changed as much as we're going to change. We have stopped, and there will be no more change. I believe the way I frame it is I say, I want further light and knowledge. I want further light and knowledge as to how to include gay LGBTQ
Yeah.
people within the church because we do not have sufficient light and knowledge to accommodate them. We absolutely do not. And everything that we have taught on it has undergone drastic changes. If you read The Miracle of Forgiveness, I think I even quoted it last time, or may not have.
I can't remember.
There's a piece in there where Spencer Kimball, he's like, there are those who say that, The Miracle of Forgiveness talks about gay people as perverts. That's the word it uses. It's a perversion, and they're perverts voluntarily. They were not made that way. You were made in the image of God. Do you believe God was made that way? They ask that as if the idea of a gay God is just the most disgusting thing you can imagine. I mean, the Miracle of Forgiveness is just saturated with reflexive and casual homophobia.
Oh yeah,
that was entirely pervasive, not just in the church, but in the world at large.
Yeah,
it's entirely consistent. So, the Miracle of Forgiveness is very much a product of its time, not just in the church, but in the world.
Yeah.
People have very short memories. Gay marriage was an abhorrent idea for most of my life, not just as a member of the church, but anywhere. And all of the polls showed Barack Obama ran in 2008 opposed to gay marriage. I mean, this is not, this is a very recent and very rapid change in how the world sees this issue. So that said, you read The Miracle of Forgiveness, and he talks about the perverts, and he talks about this is a disease that is curable. It's a disease that's probably caused by masturbation.
Yes, I remember that part.
And it's and he says there are those. I used to know this by heart. There are those who say that this cannot be changed, and that is not. To those who say it is not curable, I say, how can you say the door will not open unless you have pounded on the door until your muscles are sore and your arms are bloody? It can be done.
Yeah.
And I just look at that quote and think, how many people battered their arms against that door until their arms were nothing but bloody stumps and still found themselves gay and still found themselves transgender because that just wasn't true. It isn't a disease. It isn't a perversion. People are born that way. And the church has just, every step has been grudging. But slowly but surely, we now acknowledge that people do not choose to be gay, that getting married in a mixed faith marriage does not change sexual orientation, and you shouldn't do that. You can't pray it away. You should not expect a change in orientation. The church has acknowledged all of these things. And then just this last week or 2 weeks ago, the church backed a bill codifying the legality of same-sex marriage throughout the United States. You're going to tell me that's not a change? That is a massive change from Proposition 8.
Yeah.
When, it's a massive change. And it's not just a change in tone, it's a change in position. And there will be additional changes in position. And the church's repeated insistence, every time I see somebody or hear somebody, this is a doctrine where people have dug in their heels so hard that they feel it necessary to say over and over and over and over again, this will never, ever, 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 ever change. Never change, never change, never change. And the more nevers they pile onto it, the more they say that, the weaker their position is. You don't have to say something's going to never, ever, ever change if it's never, ever going to change, because it's solid. That kind of a statement comes from weakness, not strength. It comes from fear that it's changing whether you want it to or not. The change is coming whether you want it to or not. So the repeated insistence that it will never change, people often point to the parallel here being the priesthood and temple ban.
Yeah.
But I think a better parallel is polygamy. Because you know what, the last time we heard things would never, ever, 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 ever change was right before the Manifesto. And those were where you got the most fiery sermons that we will never, ever abandon this. We will, and John Taylor went into hiding and before he would do anything, and we would never abandon polygamy. We would never abandon plural marriage right up until the time that we did.
Right.
And so that is just not convincing. And I wish that people would stop doing that. And I wish that people would recognize that change is not a sign that the church isn't true. It's exactly the opposite. This is a church built on continuing revelation. It is baked into our scriptures. It is in our articles of faith. The idea that God will yet reveal many great and important things pertaining to the kingdom of God. How is he going to do that if those things aren't going to change anything?
Okay. I've got a
that's,
couple of thoughts. I love the passion. I'm hearing so much passion.
This just frustrates me. So
I've got a couple of thoughts. One of them's just left my mind. So the church's family proclamation, I've heard quotes from Dallin H. Oakes and President Nelson how it's not just a declaration of policy, but it is unchangeable doctrine, and that
irrevocable was the word.
Irrevocable, which is very strong language, and
it's based on irrevocable doctrine is the language.
Yes.
Dallin Oakes is a lawyer and uses his language very precisely.
Okay.
And so he didn't say the family proclamation is irrevocable doctrine. He said it is built on irrevocable doctrine.
Yeah, because I think
which
what makes the change so difficult, even if I were to support and want gay marriage, I think the difficulty is that a huge part of the plan of salvation, as the church has taught it, is marriage between a man and a woman. That's what's in the scripture. Homosexuality was always condemned as a sin. Exaltation is between a man and woman, children. It would be very hard if the church were to change its position. I personally feel like you'd have a lot of very orthodox people who would leave. They would see it as this is too big a switch. Like, I grew up in youth hearing that the standards of the world will change, but the church will not change with the standards of the world. And if we
realize the church has changed quite a bit in your lifetime.
Yeah. And if the church is bending and almost giving into societal changes, that may cause someone to think, hang on a wee minute, is the church... I understand what you're saying with regards to continual light and further knowledge, continual revelation. But then somebody might say, well, wait a minute, like God also says that, I don't walk in crooked paths, I don't vary, I don't turn from the right hand to the left. Like, if God says this is unchangeable doctrine, and then he were to say, I change it, and that's coming through the vessel of a prophet, part of you might beg the question was it ever doctrine in the first place then? If it can change, if God said it can't change, but then it can change, and then does that call into question their credibility? Because I know for me, if they were to change on that, whether or not I'm for gay marriage or not in the church, it would be such a huge bait and switch. They could claim it's revelation, but it would seem, I think, especially to all Orthodox people, such a big change where they would probably thought there's no way God would ever justify gay marriage.
Okay, I want to talk about two things. I want to get to the family proclamation, because this family proclamation is fascinating in a number of ways. But I want to start by defining terms.
Okay.
I've been told by many people that doctrine doesn't change. And I push back and I say, there is not a doctrine in the church that has not changed to some degree. Even the most basic doctrines, the doctrine of the atonement, our understanding of the atonement has changed over time. When Joseph Smith founded the church, we now believe that the atonement primarily took place in the Garden of Gethsemane, as that's when he bled from every pore and took upon himself all the sins of the world. That came with a later revelation that changed our understanding of it. And prior to that, we were like the rest of the Christian world, where we thought the atonement took place on the cross. That's a change in doctrine. Mm-hmm. What it is not is a change in truth. So this is how I use these terms. Truth is unchangeable.
Yeah.
Doctrine is not. There is such a thing as false doctrine. There is no such thing as false truth.
Right.
I mean, so it is truth that does not change. And we hope that our doctrines reflect the truth. But as we get more and more light and knowledge, they expand our doctrines to a point where we may understand that our doctrines were incomplete and not entirely correct. And therefore, they've expanded to the point where, yes, the doctrine and doctrine is synonymous with teaching. Our teachings have changed. Our teachings change consistently. So this idea that doctrine can never change, what you're talking about is truth that can never change.
Right.
And our understanding of truth, basic, pure, divine truth, is so incredibly limited by even our capacity to understand it, that there is not, to me, any kind of change. I mean, there are so few things that I can point to and say, now that is purely true. I mean, I think I can say Jesus is the Savior of the world. That is purely true. But what I understand about that and what that means and how that works, and I mean, there's so much room for more light and knowledge and more truth to inform what's going on. And that truth, truth exists independent of our interpretation of it.
Yes, I agree.
I think it is true that it is wrong to have sexual relationships with underage girls. So even if Joseph Smith believed it differently back then, it still would have been wrong because the truth doesn't change. Slavery was always wrong, I believe. It is a true thing to say slavery was always wrong, even when God was condoning it, or at least the revelations were written to condone it in the Old Testament. So it is truth, bedrock truth. So then you have to ask, okay, well, is it a bedrock truth that homosexuality is sinful and that there is no place or purpose for it in eternity? And when you say yes to that, because a lot of members would just say yes to that, no question. Absolutely, yes. We have all this revelation that says that. Then I start saying, really? Where is it? Because I want to start by excluding the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, because none of them have anything to say on this subject at all, in any way. I mean, it does not come up. And the Book of Mormon talks about how it was written for our day. If this is the colossal evil wickedness of our day that is breaking the church in half at the moment, and this will always be true, that homosexuality is evil and wicked, don't you think maybe the prophets that saw our day might have had something to say about it? The fact that it doesn't say anything. So then you have to go to the Bible. And you go to the Old Testament, and the only clear prohibitions we have against homosexuality are in the Old Testament. And they are with regard to homosexual acts that are condemned in the same way that a number of things we no longer condemn are condemned. The consumption of shellfish is condemned as an abomination, using the same word to describe not gay marriage, but just sort of the specific act in Leviticus. So essentially, you have to go to Levitical law, which is no longer binding on the church and which we no longer obey, to find the only clear prohibitions against homosexual behavior.
I think
that are
Paul
very
talks about it, doesn't he? I think, is it in the Book of Acts?
So then you're left with Paul, okay? Because you could very easily, so you're jumping ahead.
Sorry.
But you go to the Bible and you go to the Old Testament, and the Old Testament, it's in the Levitical law that we no longer live, and that we have discarded entirely with things that we recognize no longer apply to us. But yet we're somehow eager to hold on to that part of it. And I say, I mean, if we're not bound by it, we're not bound by it. You have to find more recent things to show that we're bound by it. And so then you point to Paul. And with Paul, you're left with Romans chapter 1 that describes, I mean, and I guess in the book of Jude, it talks about going after strange flesh, and it talks about all kinds of things. and what you get from Paul is been argued by all kinds of scholars. Is he condemning all homosexuality? He's certainly not condemning gay marriage, because that's not even a possibility.
Yeah.
Because so what is he condemning? And you have scholars talking about, well, he's condemning pedophilia, or he's condemning this certain practice that was happening in Greece. Paul, the more you look at Paul, the thinner the reed becomes to hang this entire doctrine on. Because Paul said a lot of things about
Yeah. Women should keep
Paul
silent
talked
in the
about
churches.
women staying quiet in the churches, and women should keep their heads covered, and all of these stuff. And we look at a lot of that and go, okay, he's dealing with cultural realities there that don't really apply to us anymore. So why are we assuming that he's sort of revealing an eternal truth about homosexuality? I mean, the concepts of homosexuality as we understand them in the 21st century just weren't considered back then. The idea of a gay identity, that I am a gay man, and you know, and what that means, that is not something that anybody would have said in Paul's time. Nobody would have considered themselves a gay man. They would have found themselves, I think, attracted to somebody of the same gender. But how to act on that, what to do with that, what society would allow with that, I mean, it just wasn't something that anybody considered. If you were a gay person in 2,000 years ago, you were either closeted or, I mean, you just didn't do anything with that. It just was not, there were no options for you. And as we've come to understand sexuality more than, we come to understand some of the scientific basis for it and all this kind of stuff, we now are faced with realities that weren't even addressed back then. So I just don't think that we have this sort of compelling scriptural evidence that God has always condemned this, and this has always been terrible.
Okay.
People point to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom and Gomorrah, the interpretation of it being a gay issue is an entirely modern one.
It's more
It's
about
not
rape,
one.
isn't it?
Well, it's not even. I mean, Ezekiel talks about the sin of God of Sodom being pride and a fullness of bread, and their unwillingness to show hospitality.
Yeah.
It doesn't say a dang thing about anything gay. It's just not. I mean, the whole thing is a modern interpretation that is superimposed on an ancient culture. And so then you get to, well, we have the family proclamation. And I like to really bug people that weaponize the family proclamation. And there's a huge contingent of DesNat. Do you know what DesNat is?
I've heard of it. They're like really extreme.
They're extremists. They're white nationalists on Twitter that want to create Deseret Nation, a nation of Mormons separate from the rest of the world. It's a theocracy.
Oh, wow.
And DesNat, the family proclamation, is far more important to them than anything else, than any of the standard works, than even the words of the living prophets. It's the family proclamation or nothing. And so when I want to make DesNat mad, I say, can you point to me where in the family proclamation it condemns gay marriage? Thanks in advance. Nowhere. Nowhere in the family proclamation does it condemn gay marriage. Oh, but it says marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God. Yeah, sure it does. How is that a condemnation of gay marriage? I mean, it's an affirmation of heterosexual marriage. And I don't know that you would find any gay person that would say that marriage between a man and a woman isn't ordained of God. They're not trying to get rid of male-female marriage. They're trying to supplement it with something else. They're not trying to replace it. And well, it says here that children should only be born to a man and a woman who are legally and lawfully wedded. And said, no, the words it uses is it says the powers of procreation should only be employed by a man and a woman who are legally and lawfully wedded. And then I get really snotty and I say, well, show me, I didn't realize that a gay couple can procreate. Oh, you know what they mean. They mean sex. Well, but they say powers of procreation. I can read that line as an injunction against having children out of wedlock. That a married man and woman should have children, because a man and a man can't have children. A woman and a woman can't have children. So they don't have the power of procreation in their marriage. Oh, no. I mean, every single exclusionary application of the family proclamation comes by inference, not by explicit statement. It's all inferred. There are so many ways to interpret that document inclusively. If you're willing to say that Jacob chapter 2 allows polygamy with its little thing about how raising up seed, the family proclamation at the very end of it says, individual circumstances might require individual adaptation.
Yeah.
This doesn't apply to everybody. You may have to adapt. Divorce, death, or other circumstances, it says, may require individual adaptation. Well, why can't one of those other circumstances be that you're in a gay marriage?
Revelation adapted to the circumstances.
I mean,
that's me quoting the happiness letter, by the way.
I'm sorry, what?
I said that's me quoting the happiness letter, but we'll not get into that.
Oh, the happiness
We've moved away from polygamy.
We could go the happiness. It's so funny every time that's quoted by like general authorities, as if it's like, do you realize the context of why this was written?
Yeah.
Anyway, but the other thing in it, there's a line in there that gender is eternal.
Yes.
Gender is an eternal part of our identity. First of all, that's a change. That's a huge change. Joseph Fielding Smith taught that gender is not eternal, and that those in the lower kingdoms will have no gender.
Yes, I remember reading that. Was it him that said there was some prophet? I remember reading this in a manual on celestial marriage, that those in the bottom kingdoms will have their reproductive sacred parts removed, and that's why they won't be able to procreate and have eternal offspring. I remember I like, oh, that kind of makes sense whenever I read it as like a seminary student.
Well, then gender isn't eternal. I mean, if you have your gender removed, if you're in the lower kingdoms, then gender isn't eternal. So even that statement is a change of what we've taught. And there were a lot of people that taught that gender didn't begin until you came to this earth. That intelligence was sort of this non-gendered, non-individualized substance that was transformed into a spirit, and maybe the spirit's gendered, but I mean, we don't know. I mean, we don't have any information on any of that. But so the statement in the family proclamation that gender is eternal is a change. And it's one that many transgender people embraced within the church. They're like, oh, gender is eternal. Great. So the fact that that whatever this mortal thing is, it's my eternal gender that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in my mortal gender. I'm interested in my eternal gender. And my eternal gender is, and that required Dallin Oakes to finally come out and explicitly say, which he did, no, we're talking about the gender, the biological gender with which you were born.
Yeah, that was the gender you had premortally. That's what you'll have after this.
Yeah, but the point is that the family proclamation does not say that. Dallin Oakes added that after the family proclamation was issued. The family proclamation is open to wider, more inclusive interpretations than people realize.
Okay.
And I just want to put that out there, that it is not the obstacle to further light and knowledge that people think it is. That the church is not tied into continual exclusion because of the family proclamation, even if we accept that the family proclamation is revelation. And accepting that is very problematic for one very specific reason. Boyd K. Packer tried to say in General Conference that it was revelation. 2010, Boyd K. Packer gives a talk that gets a lot of press because he changed, the talk was changed between the time it was delivered and the time it was printed. Do you remember this? He gave a talk about homosexuality. And he says that some people feel they're born homosexual. That's not true. Why would Heavenly Father do that to anyone? He's your
Oh,
father.
yeah. It's ringing about.
And that was taken out because the church now teaches the church now teaches that we don't choose our orientation.
Yes, that's right.
They've come just up to the line of being able to say you're born with it.
Yeah.
But they're not willing to go that far yet. I think eventually they will, because I think
Yeah.
the science is pretty dang clear. But
Yeah,
so the church, but there was another part of that talk that was also changed and didn't get nearly as much attention. If you go back and watch it, and I have,
I could put the
Lord
link in the
King Packer,
description for listeners to check it out. I want to go back and rewatch
go
it.
back and watch it because it's still online. You have to watch it. You can't read it because it's not in the printed version.
Oh,
He
okay.
talks about the family proclamation, and then he says it qualifies according to the definition as a revelation, and it would do well members read and follow, or something like that. It doesn't make any grammatical sense, and you hear him stuttering in the middle of it, and you get the sense very clearly as you watch it that sentence where he says this qualifies as a revelation was not on the teleprompter, because it doesn't match what he says later.
Right.
And as he goes on with the talk, there's no more stumbling. So here's the teleprompter, and he decides to add as a sentence, this is a revelation.
Off script.
Yeah. Off script. And it doesn't show up in the printed talk. I don't know this for sure, but I very strongly believe and have talked to people who have better evidence than I do that LGBTQ issues are the most divisive issues in the current Quorum of the 12 and the 70, and that the family proclamation is divisive.
Yeah.
There is a reason the family proclamation has not been presented to the church as a whole as a revelation and sustained and put in the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. The reason is, in order to do that, you have to have unanimity among the 12 to do that. And there does not seem to be that unanimity. And so you have Elder Packer and Elder Oaks and all of these people who cite the family proclamation and trying their darndest to come up to that line and say, look, this is it. This is revelation. This is scripture. This is, RFM calls it super scripture. He says, how many other scriptures do you have framed and posted on your wall? But you have the family proclamation framed and posted everywhere. People have it in their homes. You see it in chapels.
Yeah.
We don't have sections of the Doctrine and Covenants framed and posted in chapels. But it is not scripture. It has not been canonized. It is not in our standard works. And I think part of that is that there's still a great deal of division, a great deal of heat behind the scenes as to how we handle this. And it gives me hope that there is room for further light and knowledge, that as they're battling this out behind the scenes, they're asking good questions.
Yeah.
And we're not going to get those answers until they do. But it allows me to, when I talk about my struggle with that policy that almost drove me out of the church, I talk about the revelation I received, which was not a confirmation that the policy was wrong or a condemnation of the policy. It wasn't any of that. It was, I'm well aware of this. I know this is going on. Be patient. It will all work out in the end. And I've not been given privy to how it will work out in the end, but I'm confident that it will. I believe this is the Lord's church. I believe they are prophets. I believe they are apostles. I also believe they are weak and fallible men like I am.
Right.
But I think, what is it? Is it Martin Luther King who said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think the same is true in the church. Eventually, we're going to get where we need to be. I'm not going to explicitly say where we need to be. I'm not the Lord. I do not have the authority to say where we need to end up, but I think we're going to get there.
Right. I know there's been people who, there was a former sister missionary, I won't say her name, but she put up a very long post, seemed very sincere and heartfelt to me. She was bearing her testimony of, the Book of Mormon, the prophet Joseph Smith, sharing her spiritual testimony. And she identified as lesbian. She said that she's prayed long and hard about the matter, struggled with it for years, counseled with God about it. And she received a personal revelation that Heavenly Father was telling her that he's created her, gay, and that he approves of her having a loving homosexual relationship. Whenever I first read it, my Orthodox brain, I can't remember I think this was before my faith crisis. So my Orthodox brain was like, God wouldn't give you that revelation because he can't contradict himself. But then the open-minded person in me now would say, well, who am I to say that her revelation isn't valid or isn't real? It's just a product of her own desires. But then, oh, my revelation is valid because it's in harmony with, my predetermined beliefs, and it fits in with what the church is saying. And there's even, I think David Archuleta said that he had a similar experience when he was praying about it as well. So finishing off with prophets, moving to Revelation. Hope you're okay time wise. Jeremy says, in his CES letter, yesterday's doctrine, today's false doctrine, yesterday's prophets or today's heretics. It's a bit flippant.
Yeah.
But I understand his point, and he's saying, like, what's the point of following a prophet if they're sort of like a product of their time, if they're claiming things from God which turn out later to be false? What we're hearing from the prophet in the corner of the 12 now, in 20 years' time, they could be saying complete opposite things. Maybe gay marriage is allowed. What if they were to drastically say, you don't even need to go through the temple endowment, to make it to the celestial kingdom? What if they were to say that, the book of Abraham's not scripture? Like, what if they made very drastic changes to the point where it's like, how can they justify, changing so many things? At one point, do you say, you can't make that change, like it's too foundational? And I guess if they've been wrong about some things doctrinally, and you probably maybe addressed this a little bit, I know in my mind, because I grew up with the black and white view, that it's hard for me to, does it not call into question their credibility to an extent if they're doctrinally wrong about things, or if they gave a false prophecy, if it was another religious leader, it would probably undermine their credibility as a prophet. Maybe it's unrealistic expectations or assumptions I have of what a prophet should be. But some people would say, why still believe they are prophets if they are wrong about maybe things like that can be disproved, maybe a little bit with science, maybe some theories they had? Then why believe them when it comes to spiritual claims, which can't be tested outside of maybe Moroni's promise, which you could say is maybe a spiritual test? You've alluded to that earlier, but what would be your sort of response to that big question?
I would just toss out the whole paradigm, because that's sort of the prophetically infallible paradigm, and say, I just don't expect any of that. I expect my prophets to get things wrong once in a while. I think they get far more right than they get wrong, because whenever we start talking about this, it's as if all they do, I mean, Jeremy frames this as a way that everything that prophets have said has been repudiated by later prophets. And that's nonsense.
Yeah,
that's nonsense. I mean, 95 or more % of what you hear in General Conference is what they were teaching in General Conference in the first General Conferences, since we talk the same values, the same principles, same ordinances. We're not giving up baptism by immersion. There doesn't seem to be a huge debate as to whether or not that's still appropriate.
Right. Yeah.
The prophets get far more right than they get wrong, but they are capable of getting things wrong, and they're capable of getting big things wrong. Because a lot of people say, yeah, they can get things wrong, but they sort of put a threshold on how much they're allowed to get wrong and still be prophets. So if they got something so big wrong about, particularly about, racism and the priesthood temple ban, then they can't be prophets because that's too big. That's outside the radius of allowable fallibility. I don't have a radius of allowable fallibility. That does not mean I don't have a line. I mean, if we decided that Elvis and not Jesus is the savior of the world, I'm out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That would cross a line for me. But that's kind of the, you have to get to something that foundational for me to say, okay, these guys are completely up in the night. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints no longer worships Jesus Christ. I'm going somewhere else.
Right.
But I expect change going forward.
Yeah.
I don't fear it. I don't limit it. I don't, and it could be anything. It could be the temple. I expect a great deal of change in the temple. We talked about the Masonic stuff.
Yes.
I can see a streamlined temple ceremony that doesn't have any Masonic elements in it. If I were to write the temple ceremony, I feel I could do that. Preserve the covenants, preserve the things that matter, and the Masonic elements just sort of disappear.
Would you keep the film?
No, heavens no. I mean, I'm talking about a ceremony that would last maybe 5-10 minutes.
Oh, well.
I mean, I'm not president of the church. You don't have to worry that that's going to come. I don't think I'm going to be president of the church. Maybe because I just said that. I mean, I was right in line, and then they heard that, and then they said no. But
you're removed off their list now.
I'm off the list. But there's so, and I've seen so many changes. I was a kid in the days before the 3-hour block. People, you get up, you go to church for, I don't know, 2-3 hours. You go to priesthood, you go to Sunday school, then you go home and you come back for sacrament meeting, and then you have these other meetings. And primary was in the middle of the week. I went to junior Sunday school on Sundays. I didn't go to primary on Sundays. I went to primary on Tuesdays. And then all of a sudden, it's all crammed into one thing in 3 hours, and that was a huge shift. And now it's down to 2 hours. And COVID, I think, really woke people up to, wow, we have a lot of meetings in this church that we don't need.
Yeah.
It was all of a sudden, wow, I mean, how much, why do missionaries have to wear white shirts and ties? Show me the revelation that talks about white shirts and ties for missionaries. I mean, there's so many cultural things. It's like, why can't we applaud in chapels? There's a great musical number, and at the end we can't applaud, and why? I mean, there's just so much that we just do that I sit here and anytime change comes down the pike, I get excited because I think there should be more and will be more. And not just procedural changes. The changes on LGBTQ issues have been huge, and they have happened, so grudgingly and so sort of reactively that people are able to point at them and pretend that they haven't happened, but they have. They're huge. They're big. There will be more. Will that drive people out? I don't know. Plural marriage, that was a huge change for people. I don't know that we're facing anything that's that size. Plural marriage defined the church in the 19th century and then was repudiated by the church. Massive, massive change. The church survived it. I think the church, that's the other thing, is that my core faith is solid enough to recognize that the church is not God, but this is God's church. And so there was an old adage, I don't know if they still use it, but they'd say the church has to be true, otherwise the missionaries would have ruined it long ago.
Yeah, I've heard that saying.
But the church has to be true, otherwise all of us would have ruined it long ago. At its core, there is some value here in this church that isn't going away. And however, we struggle, there is a core of eternal, unchanging truth at its core that we only understand in part. We look through a mirror darkly, to quote Paul.
Yeah.
And as it gets clearer and clearer, and the church changes to accommodate it, I think we can expect huge changes. And I think it would be helpful I will say this, I think it would be helpful if the general authorities were willing to more publicly acknowledge the possibility of error and the reality of error. You know, that quote by Elder Uchtdorf that you read earlier, if you ever ask, okay, so they made mistakes, can you name one for me? No one's willing to do that. I mean, no one's willing to publicly say, oh yeah, well, this was a mistake. We need to get to a point where we can do that. We need to get to a point, and maybe before we get all the changes that we need to change the culture of the church to the point where we recognize the possibility and the reality of error so that we can repent of it and learn from it and move forward. That's the problem with polygamy. We're asking questions now about polygamy that we should have asked 150 years ago. These questions should have been asked, while polygamy was still happening, but certainly they should have been asked right after the Manifesto. We should have been leaning into it and doing everything we could to understand it.
Yeah.
And we weren't willing to do that. And we're still not willing to do that. And it's holding us back. But the more we can do that, the more we can confront all this stuff head on, deal with it, and move forward, the healthier we're going to be.
I agree. It needs to be confronted.
Yeah.
How are you time-wise? I was going to ask a final couple of questions.
My wife's going to, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't wrap this up fairly soon.
Okay.
So,
well, I'll ask just the last couple of questions. There's a section on just, personal revelation in general. Jeremy talks about, well, there's people in other religions who have claimed to have maybe spiritual experiences or feeling like God has told them their religion is right.
right.
And then so that's sort of like the first part. And then he also talks about, is personal revelation, how reliable is that? How do you know it's not just your brain, elevation, emotion? And there's people who have maybe they feel like they've had a testimony of the church or the Book of Mormon. And this is one that I can relate to because he also says that some people have felt like they had a revelation about, who to marry or, where to work or something like that. And then that revelation turns out to be wrong. And I had a personal experience of that on my mission. I won't go too much into it, but he asked this question and he says, there are many members who share their testimonies that the Spirit told them they would admire this person or go to this school and move this location. They rely on the Spirit making critical life decisions. If individuals can be so convinced that they're being led by the Spirit, but yet be so wrong by what the Spirit tells them, how can they be sure of the reliability of this exact same process and method in telling them that Mormonism is true? And believe it or not, before I even looked into anything with church history, I asked near enough that same question in my journal and in my prayers to God whenever I had that experience of thinking this girl was feeling like I had spiritual confirmations or spiritual signs. And even looking back, it was not just like, oh yes, I have feelings and I just mistook that for my desires. Like looking back, some of them did seem like spiritual confirmations, and it was very hard because I had similar spiritual confirmations with the church or with the Book of Mormon.
Right.
But when that one didn't come to pass, it called into question, how do I know this is a real revelation? I know that's not a question for you to answer per se, but there have been people who have believed they've had a personal revelation about something and then maybe been wrong. And then why should you give more credence to, oh, that revelation was wrong, but the revelation you received about the Book of Mormon, that one's correct, that one's true.
Right.
What are your thoughts on just like the reliability and trustworthiness of revelation? Because it's subjective in a way.
Yeah, it's very subjective. And that was the section of the CES letter where I really felt like we had failed Jeremy as a church.
Yeah.
Because the way he was describing revelation and he was describing personal revelation and the Holy Ghost, he uses an example that, the good feelings he had reading the Book of Mormon were a lot like the good feelings he had when he was watching The Lion King.
I love
does
The Lion
that
King.
mean that Simba is a real character? Or is real? And I just thought, if that is your understanding of revelation, we do a terrible job of teaching what revelation is or how it's supposed to work and what it means. You say it's subjective. It's very subjective, so much so to the point where I think in my life I can count on one hand the number of times I feel I have received the kind of revelation that I think is worthy of that description. I mean, I think I've had promptings and sort of, inspiration. And again, we talked about this earlier, inspiration versus revelation.
Yeah.
I've had, promptings and been poked and prodded by the Spirit. Kind of the revelation where I receive information that I didn't have prior, and I receive it in a way that is kind of all encompassing and really kind of undeniable. Again, I could count that on one hand, and I want to tell you one quick story of when I received it.
Yeah.
People talk about praying to know who they should marry or getting a confirmation to get married. That's ubiquitous. Every missionary, the minute they hit the ground, they're 21 years old and they're praying to get that revelation. And then they date somebody and then they pray, should I marry them? And I thought, well, okay, I'm living right. I should get that. And I would pray, and should I marry, is this, that, the other. And when I started dating the woman who is now my wife, I thought, this is the girl I want to marry. This is the girl this seems to make the most sense. I love her and I want to marry her. And Lord, is this the girl I'm supposed to marry? And I got nothing. Zero, like nothing. And it wasn't a stupor of thought. I mean, I think I've had some of those. It wasn't go running somewhere, but I got absolutely nothing, to the point where I'm in bed the night before my wedding and I'm panicked that I'm making a huge mistake because I have not received a spiritual confirmation that this is the woman I'm supposed to marry. And so I was like, well, I don't have other plans, and we paid a lot for the reception, and I better go through with this. And I was kneeling in the temple across the altar, holding my soon-to-be wife's hand. And the sealer is talking. The sealer was my mission president.
Oh, wow.
And I got a just very clear, very simple, very pure, it's not just a good, warm, nice, happy feeling. Because I kind of had that before that. It's like I'm in a place, I'm about to get married, and all these people I love, and I feel great. It was just this overwhelming assurance that the Lord was very pleased with what I was doing, and that I was absolutely doing the right thing with the right person. And I actually got angry sitting there I
remember you saying that in your moment.
And I just thought, I could have used this an hour ago. I mean, you didn't give this to me until I'd gone all the way through with it and I couldn't back out. And that's when you finally give me the revelation I've been screaming for the better part of a year. And I really, that is the way God deals with me. And this is subjective because other people, I don't trust revelation from other people when they talk about, I talk about this as people who seem to get revelation for which brand of toothpaste they ought to use.
Yeah.
The just revelation just comes and it comes for the most
everything's God communicating with them.
It's like, I don't trust that, because that's not why you're here. We lived in an environment before we came to this earth where that's what it was. We lived in the presence of God. We knew exactly what God expected of us, wanted us to do. And, every single moment of our life was guided by that perfect knowledge. That knowledge has been veiled from us so we could come to earth to see what we do when we're left on our own. And so we have to stumble around and make decisions that are sometimes wrong decisions. And the kind of revelation that confirms every little thing that we do just defeats the purpose of mortality, as far as I'm concerned. So the revelations that I have received, like that one in the temple, they are so clear and so far beyond, at least in my experience, the kind of warm fuzzies you feel when you're watching a good movie.
Right. It's deeper and more powerful.
I think we have made a mistake in telling people to expect that kind of undeniable revelation. This is my wife calling me. We're wrapping up, and then I'll make gingerbread.
Are you making gingerbread?
No, I say hello to Stephen Murphy from Northern Ireland.
Hello.
Oh, you're still okay.
All right.
We're wrapping up. Sorry for taking so long.
Okay, but I will make it as soon as I finish. We're wrapping up.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Bye. There we go. That's the woman that I received a revelation that I was to marry. But we have, I think, falsely raised expectations, or raised false expectations of people who assume that is going to be commonplace.
Yeah.
And we raised false expectations that's commonplace in the lives of the 12 and the first presidency, that they are guided by this overwhelming, perfect knowledge 24 hours a day of exactly where and what to do. And that defeats the purpose of mortality for them too. I mean, that's not why we're here. We are here to walk by faith. We are here to make mistakes. We are here to learn from those mistakes. So I think we failed Jeremy in having him expect something and not get something that was at that level for just about everything. You said something else that I wanted to return to, and I can't remember what it was. Anyway, so how can we say it's because if it's not reliable? No, the other thing you said was people outside the church that receive revelation.
Yeah.
And how do we reconcile that? And my answer is I don't. And that frustrated John DeLynn to no end when I told him that. Do I believe that somebody can receive a revelation that tells them that they should stay in the Catholic Church and that the Catholic Church is true? Yeah, I believe people can get those revelations. I don't know. I don't know what it is that God is telling them. I remember I had one experience where I was dating a girl that I wanted to marry, and she was not a member of the church, and she was very religious in her own right. And this came to a head, and we ended up just sort of parting ways. But then we were able to establish a friendship afterwards. And she was going off on some kind of sort of missionary experience for her own church. And I remember getting this feeling from the Lord that he was pleased with what she was doing. He's like, she's helping people. She's doing exactly she's doing what I want her to do. I wanted her to join the church and marry me, but that didn't happen. And she never join the church, and I think she's still very religious. I don't know how the Lord talks to other people. How can I possibly know that? I only know how the Lord talks to me.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing I can testify of. That's the only thing I can stand by. And nothing about how the Lord talks to me requires me to invalidate somebody else's experience.
Yeah, got you.
Nothing. And I don't. And this also comes to the idea that I'm also somewhat of a universalist. I think everybody ends up getting where they need to be in the end. And so if the Lord wants somebody to be a Catholic in mortality because there's something he can do to use them to bless other people's lives with them in that church as opposed to this church, who am I? I can't question that. I mean, I can't, and I've met so many good people of all walks of life and with all kinds of different faiths. and with no faith at all, at least no faith in God. I think everybody has faith in something, but that's another story altogether. But, they are as much children of God as I am. God is as mindful of them as he is of me. And I think God didn't send them here to fail. I think that eventually, I cannot see the eternal picture. I don't know how it works, and I don't know what God is saying to people as they're trying to get their way around. But I will never, ever second guess somebody's spiritual experience outside the church. I absolutely believe they happen outside the church. I absolutely believe God uses people outside the church to do great, great things.
Yeah, I love that. I remember once listening to a near-death experience. A man, I've listened to so many, but it was an atheist who went to, well, he talked about going to like a hellish place. He was rescued by Jesus and was brought before Jesus, and he was pretty much given a message they needed to change his selfish life he was living and to, treat others good and to testify of Jesus. And I remember he asked Jesus, which religion or church should I join? And my ears perked up. And the response Jesus gave was one that surprised me, but then didn't surprise me. He said, whichever religion brings you closest to me. So although that's subjective, it's a subjective experience. Part of me was like, what? Like, it had to be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
But there's a part of me that
have you seen that South Park where they go into hell and they're all in hell, and this guy's like, well, I'm a Jehovah's Witness and I was a faithful Protestant. It's like, well, you chose the wrong religion as well. Which is the right one? The Mormons. The Mormons are the right answer. So,
but to me, whenever I listened to his experience, part of me thought, like, you know what, I wouldn't be surprised in the next life if that's kind of what it's more about. Like, I think heaven's going to be a lot bigger than my beliefs of what it will be in here, what I expect.
I'm with you 100%.
Last question or two. Understand, I want to let you go. We could have talked about things with the modern church science, but I want to finish with your thoughts to those who leave the church. They can be labeled as apostates. They're deceived, sinful, traitors. They've made the worst spiritual decision of their life. I suppose if the church is true and everything it claims to be, then I can understand people saying that of them. I want to get your take on those who leave the church due to coming to that conclusion, or those who maybe might be considered critics from your personal interactions. And then for you to share your advice or counsel to someone who's just in a faith crisis, who wants to stay, but they feel like they don't know how they can be intellectually honest, and they're burdened by all these issues and doubts and concerns.
I've been in 2 bishoprics, and I've been in several disciplinary councils, and that have involved, and I want to be very, very vague.
You mean courts of love?
And courts of love. Actually, they're very spiritual experiences, only because, at least in my experience, it was very clear that the bishop and his counselors wanted to do the right thing that would bless the lives of the people.
Yeah, I mean, I was in disciplinary council, and it was a good, positive experience.
It was all of my experiences were good, positive experiences. None of these were disciplinary councils for apostasy, and they weren't for anybody that was hostile to the church. It was for people who were trying to get their lives in order.
Yeah.
And after the verdict, and the verdict ranged from nothing to excommunication in a number of them, but even in the most extreme verdicts, the answer was, okay, now we show an increase of love. Now that you are no longer a member of the church, we are going to love you even more, and we're going to do whatever we can to help you, and we're going to, and we did, and this bishop did. Okay, well, this is somebody who has left the church, and yet we're showing them an increase of love. Now, they didn't leave the church, in rebellion or after faith crisis or anything like that, but they're an excommunicated member, and the counsel we're giving as a bishopric is, we need to show more love to you than we showed you while you were still a member of the church.
Yeah.
I don't understand why that's not the standard for people who leave. I don't understand why, I was astonished when I expressed my doubts that everybody said, leave, get lost. How many people, that's the first reaction. And then you leave the church and somehow people think it justifies their faith. I think this is why the reaction is that, oh, geez, if they didn't make a terrible decision, that means I've made a terrible decision to stay. I have to justify my decision to stay by demeaning their decision to leave. I think that's so short-sighted and so ridiculous. And it's like saying, well, the church now gives up on you, and Jesus has given up on you. And we know Jesus doesn't give up on anybody, but the church does. And the members of the church absolutely do. We've not created any kind of an environment. I was talking to a friend of mine who's left, a very good friend of mine, and he said, there's no way to leave with dignity. You cannot leave with your dignity intact. And this friend actually, he left while he was in a stake presidency and had a faith crisis and left the church. And he was the subject of a talk in stake conference about how, he's like Lucifer who fell from a great height, and now his life is completely off the rails, and his family's off the rails. And it's like his family's doing great, and he's got a great life, and he's got a great marriage. He's just no longer a member of the church.
Yeah.
And we don't build anybody's faith or do anybody any favors by doing that. And the thing that's been so surprising to me is I've sort of wandered into this world of apologetics and defending the church and whatever, is this was a problem that was not even on my radar as an active member of the church. Before I wrote the CES letter reply, I didn't even think about people who had left.
Yeah.
Which shows how selfish and short-sighted I am. But nobody really close to me had left in any kind of way. Well, that's not necessarily true either. But it didn't occur to me that I was supposed to not like them anymore, or not talk to them anymore, or have any relationship with them anymore. And sorry, this is my daughter texting me. Don't have my do not disturb.
You're okay.
But I've seen, since I wandered into this world, just the pain and the division that is so unnecessary for people who leave. I've told all of my kids, my love for you and acceptance of you and your inclusion in this family is in no way contingent upon your participation in the church. I would love you to continue to participate in the church for your entire lives. And if you choose not to, I will love you as well. That will not change. And I mean that. And that's absolutely true. And that's the same for anybody.
Yeah.
So I really feel like it shows weakness in the church that we cannot live up to our own values when it comes to loving and accepting and showing forth an increase of love for those who have left. I think we should love them more and include them more after they're gone, rather than vice versa. I really feel like if Joseph Smith did anything inspired, the 121st section of the Doctrine and Covenants is inspired.
Yes.
The whole idea of no power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood. I mean, that is the perfect manual for how any leader should function. And it's a perfect manual for how the church should function. Yeah. And if we rebuke betimes with sharpness those who we feel have to leave, we have to show an increase of love afterwards. And we don't. We kick people out.
We smear them, dehumanize a little bit.
And if they leave, we demonize them, we shun them, we treat them like garbage. And I just don't understand that at all. That seems to me to be antithetical to everything I believe and everything I was taught.
And I feel quite passionate with you on that topic as one who's had family members who have left, who, I don't like that they're considered apostate, traitors, anti-Mormon. And me having gone through a faith crisis, left the church, came back to the church, and having people say those things about me. Majority of people were very loving and understanding. The small minority
Mhm.
And I agree with you. There should be less division on both sides. But there can be people who leave the church who can also be hostile to their
Yeah,
active
yeah.
believing members. And I think
I mean,
there should be more
I mean,
understanding, more empathy from both sides.
that's those are the comments. Like after I went on John DeLynn, all the emails I got before that were from believers
Yeah,
or people in faith crisis who said, "Thank you, you helped me hold on to my faith," or "Thank you, you know." But after I went on John DeLynn, a lot of my messages, most of them actually, were from ex-members of the church who insisted, "You did not convince me to come back to church,
yeah,
but you helped me see my still believing family, friends, spouse uh, with more charitable eyes. You help me to understand that it is possible that some of the people who are still in the church aren't necessarily all terrible, and maybe I need to be kinder to them."
yeah.
And I take that as a huge,
That's a
huge
huge
win.
win. Yeah,
I
there
just
need to be more.
love that, and I love getting messages like that. And you know, I just there's I mean, leaving the church. I have yet to meet anybody who has left the church who has taken that action lightly. I mean, I've seen people who sort of drift away from the church because they're not really involved. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about somebody who's actively involved in the church who finally makes the decision to leave. Nobody does that without pain.
Yeah,
Nobody does that lightly. That is a huge and very often courageous decision because, I mean, they're jeopardizing family relationships, they're jeopardizing friends. They shouldn't be, but they are because the family and friends, we need to do better. Sometimes they're jeopardizing their employment. You know, particularly in Utah, it's not probably as big a deal in Northern Ireland, but
no,
you know, it could. I mean, people work for the church, obviously, so you're jeopardizing your employment. But also people working for church members who are uncomfortable employing apostates, and suddenly, I mean, it's a huge cost. They don't make that decision on a whim.
that's a huge part of their worldview, their identity,
Huge
their
part of their
purpose.
worldview, and we need to take responsibility as a church for letting them down to some
Yeah,
degree. I mean, I always feel like
judging
we
and not
failed you.
listening.
It's like with Jeremy, it's like we failed you when we taught you that about the Spirit, if that's what you think the Spirit is. You know, if we weren't able to empathetically listen to your problems in faith crisis and deal with this, and then that's
I
on
think
us.
I think the problem with a lot of people in faith crisis is I had a really great stake president who tried to listen and to counsel with me. He was great, but I think most leaders will tell you stop researching, stop
Yeah,
looking at anything critical. It's anti-Mormon lies. Just go back to doing the spiritual things, and the person can feel I think gaslight's not the right word, but they can just feel like misunderstood and that
yeah.
invalidated and
Well,
that
people
you're
who
the
leave
problem.
very often have been reading more than they were reading when they were blissfully unaware of all these problems.
Yeah.
I mean, they're reading scriptures more. I mean,
Hmm.
they're reading everything. They're devouring as much information as they can. And to be told that's the danger, you're just going to find too much information. I mean, that doesn't lead anybody back. I mean, when you asked what would I say to somebody who's in faith crisis, the reason I was able to survive my faith crisis is the people I was able to talk to about it were not like those leaders. They were
Yeah.
my father, they were my uncle, uh, and I mean, they were people who took me seriously, who listened to me, and who were knowledgeable enough to have at least the beginnings of some kind of answers that I could hold on to. And I think uh, the only way a testimony can survive a faith crisis is if you give yourself enough time and have enough resources to deal with it. And when I
Yeah.
read The Truth About the God Makers, you know, I read The God Makers and then I read the book The Truth About the God Makers. It wasn't that The Truth About the God Makers answered all my questions definitively now and forever, amen. It was the truth about the God Makers put a brake on my panic, kept me from panicking. When you're in faith crisis, you're panicking. You're like, everything I know is a lie. Everything I've been taught is a lie. And you're just panicked. And then all of a sudden, if you can reach a point where you're open to the possibility that maybe there are answers that are satisfying, that'll be enough for you. The minute you can reach that point is the minute I think you can be all right.
Yeah.
Maybe you won't be all right. Maybe you'll say, okay, maybe there are answers, and then you do your own research and you decide, nope, there aren't, and I'm gone. In which case, God bless you, I respect you, and I will still be your friend, and I hope you have a magnificent life ahead of you, and a magnificent faith journey. But that's, I think, the point. If you can reach a point where you can stabilize, where you can at least consider the possibility that maybe not everything you've been taught is a lie. Maybe you're going to have to reframe everything. You've probably been looking at this from a perspective that is no longer sustainable, and you can. But if you can accept that and realize maybe there's something better in the church, I really feel like my faith is better and stronger for having been through faith crisis, rather
more refined, more thoughtful,
more refined, and more. I just think I understand God better.
More mature,
not just the church, but I feel like, okay, this has been a process where the one guy you need to reach out to is not anybody else, it's the Lord. And leaders who talk about that frame it as if they are the Lord. Yeah, reach out to the Lord, but only ask him these questions that we tell you you're allowed to ask him, and don't look at these questions. And that just doesn't work. That's not sustainable.
No.
That's not good advice, and too many leaders give that advice. But the reason I am hopeful for the future of this church is that the Lord's hand is in it. And I don't think we should be nervous as to what the Lord will tell us if we reach out to him. And you know, it's interesting because I have not received the kind of revelation in my faith Christ since the revelation that I most recently received on this score has not been sort of a confirmation that the church is true, so much as a confirmation that this is where the Lord has put me.
Yeah.
This is where the Lord wants me. This is where I can do the most good. I don't know if that's enough for some people. And so when I get frustrated with the church and I think about, okay, geez, this is driving me crazy, and maybe I just want to throw it all in, that's what I lean on now. I lean on, I have a relationship with God that is independent of my relationship with the church. Independent is the wrong word. Maybe it's not. I mean, the church has facilitated that relationship. The church has pointed me in that direction, but it's that relationship that I rely on and that I count on, and that God has told me this is where I ought to be.
Yeah.
And so this is where I'm staying, and this is what I'm fighting for. I am fighting for this church. I believe in this church. I want this church to be better. I want to be better because of this church. And I think people who are in faith crisis, if they can find God, then I think we're going to be okay, and I think they're going to be okay. And whatever God tells them to do, I will respect it. But that's where you turn. I mean, a faith crisis, because I don't have faith in polygamy or priesthood bans, or I mean that's not what your faith is supposed to be in. Our faith is supposed to be in God. We're supposed to rely on God. We're supposed to rely on Christ. And
that should be your spiritual anchor,
they should be your spiritual anchor. And they are in this church. They are here. Their hand is in this work, along with a whole bunch of weak, fallible, able to make mistake hands that are also here. We're all here. But God has not left us comfortless. God has not left us alone, and he will not leave you alone in faith crisis. And so all I would ask, if you can find somebody who will talk to you, somebody you respect, somebody who, you can respect them spiritually, respect them intellectually. And for me, I had access to people that I wish everybody had access to. But there are people like that in the church all over the place. I know several of them.
Yeah.
And there are people in your ward, and it may not be your bishop, it may not be your stake president. It may even be a woman. This church doesn't have women in the leadership positions to do that. But I've met several women who have so much empathy and understanding of this. There are resources out there. Just don't panic.
Yeah.
Don't, I mean, you don't need to leave the church today. You can leave the church whenever you want. But people, they discover something terrible. They discover Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl, and they think, I need to leave the church today. I can't be in this for one more minute. I got to go. It's like, you still can go, but give yourself enough time to the point where you're going on your own terms, that you're not going in a moment of panic.
Yeah.
That you made a clear-eyed decision. You've looked at all the information you need to look at. If you still decide after that you need to leave the church, God bless you. I sustain you, and that's great.
Yeah. I think
I really feel like we need to approach people with faith crisis that way, because I don't see any other way that works.
Yeah.
I don't think shaming them into staying works. I don't think bullying them into staying works, or telling them they're lazy learners, or they're, I just don't think we treat institutionally. I don't think we've handled this well, and I don't think the brethren. I think the brethren are as confused as anybody, because these are men who, I think all of them are hardcore believers in their heart, and they, they love this church, and it just doesn't dawn on them why anybody would want to leave.
Yeah.
To some degree. And so it's just this kind of, and so I think we're getting better, but not as fast as I would like. Slowly but surely, we'll get there. Again, the arc bends towards justice, but the arc is long, and right now we're in the middle of a long arc. So,
and I think it can be hard to fully understand those in faith crisis, I think, until you sort of go through one, and to an extent yourself. And what my hope and intention with this channel, there's a time where I felt like maybe I need to leave the church again, and I felt a similar advice, whether it was spiritual or in my own mind, to take things slow, as you say, to really confront these things, fair and objective, and to really take things slow and to reach out. And I hope with this channel, trying to bring on people like yourselves, really thoughtful members of the church or faithful historians. I've had Brian Heels and Stephen Harper, and to just have conversations with people like that, to just ask the tough questions and be validated, and to not be judged, or and for them to at least respond and answer. And it can just be so validating and good to know there's people that you can address, who can be kind and who can be thoughtful and who are very well informed, and that can still provide a faithful interpretation. I think that's an important resource that people need. There needs to be more dialogue. There needs to be more transparency, more tolerance, less judgment. And yeah, I agree so much with what you're saying. And while you're in your faith crisis, like you're saying, include God in the journey. And faith in God is probably, that's the most important thing.
and
Keep that
God is
connection
not
with Him.
mad at you for being in a faith crisis.
Yeah.
That's something I didn't understand. God is not mad at you for asking these questions, and He's not. He knows what you're going through. My understanding of God pre-faith crisis is just that He's standing up there scolding me 24 hours a day. I'm not perfect. I'm not even close to perfect, and so I shouldn't even bother. And you can be in faith crisis and just sort of, whatever you do, don't toss out God.
Yeah.
The testimonies that I bear from a pulpit have been streamlined as time has gone on, but God is real. He's out there, and I absolutely believe that, and I absolutely believe you can find that. And and make him your partner, make him your ally in the faith crisis. He wants you to get through faith crisis as well as you do. So, and I'll trust wherever he leads you. I'll be great with that. Not that it matters what I think, but if you can get to that point where you can accept that okay, there is a God and he'll lead me through this, and if he leads me out of the church, so be it. Then I think you're in a healthy place, and I think you'll be fine.
Yeah, Jim Bennett, this has been just an amazing interviews and discussions we've had. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and just your perspectives, your openness, your courage to confront these things and to share your views. I admire your faith and your testimony and your honesty, and I think you have validated a lot of people who are maybe have left the church or who are in faith crisis. You know, we've talked about a lot of the tough questions, and I appreciate the time you've given, you know, to have these interviews and to talk about these things, you know, giving up your time. And I hope that the listeners will have benefited from these discussions and your insights and your own personal journey and faith. And I just can't thank you enough for this interview.
Well, Stephen, I appreciate the opportunity. This has been delightful. I think you've been delightful. I think you are doing a great thing. You are performing a great service. You are clearly a man of integrity and a man of faith, and I think that I would assume the Lord is pleased with your efforts, but I'm certainly pleased with your efforts. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Everyone check out his faithful response to CES Letter. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. Share this with other people who you think might benefit from it. And I'll see you all in future content with future interviews. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.